suggestion? Okay, because you'd walk around slingshot. Somebody's liable to shoot you.
Like I said, I didn't know.
You come here with a machine gun.
Somebody's liable to shoot you.
Like I said, I didn't know.
You come here with a machine gun.
Canal for a suggestion? Okay, because you'd walk around slingshot. Somebody's liable to shoot you.
Like I said, I didn't know.
You come here with a machine gun.
Canal for a suggestion? Okay, because you'd walk around slingshot. Somebody's liable to shoot you.
Like I said, I didn't know.
You come here with a machine gun.
Canal for a suggestion?
10-4.
You'd walk around slingshot. Somebody's liable to shoot you.
Like I said, I didn't know.
You come here with a machine gun.
Canal for a suggestion? Okay, because you'd walk around slingshot.
4.
Somebody's liable to shoot you.
Unknown at.
You come here with a
You want
machine
short
gun.
confirmation?
Canal for a suggestion? Okay.
No, we're looking for it now.
Somebody's
350, go ahead.
Like I said, I didn't know.
You come here with a machine gun.
Canal for a suggestion? Okay, you'd walk around slingshot.
4,
Somebody's liable to shoot you.
4, Tom,
You
Robert,
come here
Deacon,
with a
Frank,
machine gun.
2-3, Frank, 1-8, 6-2, 4, expel.
Liable to shoot you.
Like I said, I didn't know.
You come here with a machine gun.
Canal for a suggestion? Okay, because you'd walk around slingshot. Somebody's liable to shoot you.
Like I said, I didn't know.
You come here with a machine gun.
Canal for a suggestion? Okay, because you'd walk around slingshot. Somebody's liable to shoot you.
Like I said, I didn't know.
You come here with a machine gun.
Canal for a suggestion? Okay, because you'd
Were you clear or still on the call?
somebody's liable to shoot you.
Clear.
Like I said, I didn't know.
You come here with a machine gun.
Canal for a suggestion? Okay, because you'd walk around slingshot. Somebody's liable to shoot you.
Like I said, I didn't know.
You come here with a machine gun.
Canal for a suggestion? Okay, because you'd walk around slingshot. Somebody's liable to shoot you.
Adam 140, I'm going to be 5'8".
Mr. President,
Machine gun.
Senator from Alaska. Mr. President, it's Thursday afternoon, and it's one of my favorite times of the week, and I know for many of my fellow senators, including the presiding officer and the pages, this is one of their favorite times of the week, too, because it's the time that we get to talk about the Alaskan of the Week. Now, there are people, I had a couple people today come up, hey, Senator, when are you giving your speech on the Alaskan of the Week? I saw him later, and he said, okay, well, we're going to keep an eye on it because people find a lot of interest in what's happening in the great state of Alaska. Now, the Alaskan of the Week, as many of my colleagues know, is somebody who we like to highlight who's just done great stuff for the state, community, town, state, maybe country. Sometimes it's someone famous. But, Mr. President, oftentimes it's somebody who's been working really hard for much of their life and doesn't get a lot of recognition, just doing it. The heroes of the community. And so that's why we like to talk about the Alaskan of the Week. It's also a great opportunity to talk to people in the gallery, people watching on TV and C-SPAN, to get them to come on up to Alaska. Come on up. It'll be the trip of a lifetime. Of course, it's a gorgeous, huge state, mountains, glaciers, wildlife. But here's something else. When you get off the plane and you go to Alaska, you get the sense of freedom, liberty. You can almost breathe it in ways that you can't in other places. So I ask everybody who's watching, come on up. You'll love it. It'll be a trip of the lifetime. You'll feel that freedom in the air like you do in almost no other place in the world. So, Mr. President, let me introduce you to our Alaskan of the Week, Jeannie Follett, who has displayed incredible commitment to keep our state clean and special. All right, let's talk about Jeannie. She was born in Detroit. She moved to Anchorage when she was just 6 years old and has called Alaska home ever since. Like so many Alaskans, she's led a very interesting and varied life. She began her professional career as a court reporter for the Anchorage Daily News, our big newspaper, covering all kinds of trials when the state was still new and our court system had just been formed. Remember, we're a very young state. Eventually, she moved to Girdwood, which is a beautiful ski resort town outside of Anchorage, where she was a breakfast cook and managed condos. She got a bit restless. She packed up her 65 Mustang and drove across the country, but missed Alaska so much, she came back, home again, and then she worked on the Trans-Alaska Pipeline, TAPS as we call it, that flows the billions of barrels of oil from the North Slope down to Valdez for an energy-hungry country like ours. And then she met her husband, Ken, when she was working on the Trans-Alaska Pipeline. They bought and restored a lodge in a wonderful small community called Moose Pass, a warm, welcoming, and gorgeous Alaska community in the heart of the Kenai Peninsula, about 100 miles south of Anchorage. And if you're going to go fish the famous Russian River, Moose Pass is a great home base. Ken and Jeannie worked at the resort until they both retired. And Jeannie always liked to keep her yard and her surroundings clean and organized, free of trash. But when her husband Ken unfortunately got sick, and then tragically she lost him over 13 years ago, Jeannie began to spend her days helping clean up the state, picking up trash on the road by her house, further and further from her home in Moose Pass. Now, Mr. President, think of this. As the snow melts in Alaska and in all sorts of weather, to this day, Jeannie laces up her hiking boots, grabs her visors, her gloves, her safety vest, drives up the highway to the spot where she left off the previous day, and she starts cleaning up the highway. Every single day. She gets out her bags, she starts walking and cleaning up trash on the side of the highway. And this highway abuts the majestic, beautiful Chugach National Forest. She guesses that every summer she spends 3 to 6 hours a day volunteering, picking up trash. Think about that. Alaska is a beautiful, pristine place. As a matter of fact, that's one of the things that when people come to visit, they're going to see. But like all states, in particular highway areas and states, you have some garbage. And so Jeannie takes action every single day. Doesn't get paid. 3 to 6 hours a day. 5 days a week. She's out there cleaning up the highway.
Refusing to get down. Blue shirt, blue jeans, and cowboy.
Sometimes friends and neighbors come and help out. Boy Scouts join her. One summer she picked up 800 bags of trash to keep Alaska clean and pristine. People stop on the side of the road to talk to her, ask where the nearest gas station is. Sometimes people donate gas money to her because, remember, she's starting where she left off the next day just to drive up the highway 40 miles to continue. So it's not just time and effort, it's actual money. She thinks her presence on the side of the highway helps motivate others. There was a story recently on KTUU, Channel 2, that's our big news station in Alaska, and she said in that story, she thinks that she's helped inspire people to help keep the whole state clean, whether it's picking up trash themselves or not throwing litter outside your car. So why does she do it? Why does she do it? Several hours a day, no pay, day after day, week after week. She does it because she loves Alaska. She wants to keep it clean. She doesn't want the many tourists. We have hundreds of thousands, really millions of tourists who come to our state to see trash when it's going to be a trip of a lifetime. She said, quote, it embarrasses me to think that tourists from the lower 48 might show up in Alaska and see trash. So I'm going to clean it up. She does it because it's her way to give back to a state that has given her so much. She also gets to see things that others don't see often. Beautiful wildflowers on the road, the creeks, secret vistas. I'm sure she's seen a few bears and a lot of bald eagles and moose. She even saw a man once walking a chicken.
You come here with a machine gun.
Yes, you see everything in Alaska. A man walking a chicken. Well,
You come here with a
Jeannie,
machine gun.
she's found lost items on the side of the road, fishing licenses, cell phones, cameras, and she tries her best to get these back to their owners. Once she found a set of hubcaps that had contact information on it for the owner. When she called and told him she had his hubcaps, he couldn't believe it. He was tickled pink to get his hubcaps back. So, Mr. President, I think every state has somebody like Jeannie, there's no doubt. We all owe a debt of gratitude to people like her, working selflessly, volunteering thousands of hours to keep our states clean like Alaska, to keep America clean. So, Jeannie, thanks for what you're doing for the great state of Alaska, and thank you and congratulations on being our Alaskan of the week. I yield the floor.
Under the previous order, the Senate stands adjourned until Monday at 3 p.m.
You come here with a machine gun.
You want to deny it? Had nothing to do with that call. No idea what it is.
Correction, looks like the disturbance was at 3315 South Alameda. 3315 South Alameda. The Sugar Ridge is probably her home address.
Okay, I get the phone number.
You come here with a machine
Number
gun.
is 461-6795. 461-6795.
You come here with a machine gun.
MEChANiCAL for a suggestion? Okay, because you'd walk around slingshot. Somebody's liable to shoot you.
Like I said, I didn't know.
You come here with a machine gun.
MEChANiCAL for a suggestion? Okay, because you'd walk around slingshot. Somebody's liable to shoot you.
You come here with a machine gun.
MEChANiCAL for a suggestion? Okay, because you'd walk around slingshot. Somebody's liable to shoot you.
Like I said, I didn't know.
You come here with a machine gun.
MEChANiCAL for a suggestion? Okay, because you'd walk around slingshot. Somebody's liable to shoot you.
Like I said, I didn't know.
You come here with a machine gun. You come here with a machine gun.
MEChANiCAL for a suggestion? Okay, because you'd walk around slingshot. Somebody's liable to shoot you.
Like I said, I didn't know.
You come here with a machine gun.
MEChANiCAL for a suggestion? Okay, because you'd walk around slingshot. Somebody's liable to shoot you.
Like I said, I didn't know.
You come here with a machine gun.
Get 423.
Okay, because you'd walk around slingshot. Somebody's liable to shoot you.
Like I said, I didn't know.
You come here with a machine gun.
MEChANiCAL for a suggestion? Okay, because you'd walk around
7 of 92. First name Tori, Tom, Ocean, Robert, Ida, Stepper.
You come here with a machine gun.
Name George, Ocean, Lincoln, King, Adam.
You come here with a machine gun.
Senate will come to order. Today's opening prayer will be offered by Reverend Dr. Richard Gibbons of First Presbyterian Church from Greenville, South Carolina.
MEChANiCAL for a suggestion? Okay, because you'd walk around slingshot. Somebody's liable to shoot you.
Let us join our hearts and minds together as we pray. Let us pray. Gracious God and loving Heavenly Father, as we prayerfully seek your presence, enable us amidst complex challenges to be refreshed and renewed by the transforming nature of your extravagant love. Impart to us a profound sense of gratitude, thankful that in your sovereign purposes we are a people conceived in liberty, shaped by adversity, dedicated to equality, while fully dependent on you, for in God we trust. Father, grant to us a renewed sense of your calling, sustained by the enduring values we hold to be self-evident. Equip us by your Spirit to be a Senate defined by consensus through compassion, expertise enlightened by experience, leadership resistant to polarisation and expediency, yet intentional in unity, honesty, transparency and integrity, as together we seek to be one nation under God. We bring our prayers to you in and through the name of Christ our Lord. Amen.
Please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America.
You come here with a machine gun.
Somebody's liable to shoot you.
Like I said, I didn't know.
You come here with a machine gun.
Ed McCanal for a suggestion. Okay, because you'd walk around slingshot. Somebody's liable to shoot you.
Like I said, I didn't know.
You come here with a machine gun.
Ed McCanal for a suggestion. Okay.
Clerk will read a communication to the Senate.
Washington, D.C., July 19, 2018. To the Senate. Under the provisions of Rule 1, Paragraph 3 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, I hereby appoint the Honorable Cindy Hyde-Smith, a senator from the state of Mississippi, to perform the duties of the chair. Signed, Orrin G. Hatch, President Pro Tempore.
Under the previous order, the leadership time is reserved.
You come here with a machine gun.
Ed McCanal for a suggestion. Okay, because you'd walk around slingshot. Somebody's
170 area.
Like I said, I didn't know.
You come here with a machine gun.
Ed McCanal for a suggestion. Okay, because you'd walk around slingshot. Somebody's liable to shoot you.
You come here with a machine gun.
Ed McCanal for a suggestion. Okay, you'd walk around slingshot. Somebody's liable to shoot you.
Like I said, I didn't know.
You come here with a machine gun.
4040 South Padre Island Drive.
Because you'd walk around slingshot.
I accidentally hit start. Accidentally hit start.
You come here with a machine gun.
Ed
Could
McCanal
you
for a
resend that one, please?
okay, because you'd walk around slingshot.
Yes, I will.
Somebody's liable to shoot you.
Like I said, I didn't know.
You come here with a machine gun.
Ed McCanal for a suggestion. Okay, because you'd walk around slingshot. Somebody's liable to shoot you.
Like I said, I didn't know.
You come here with a machine gun.
Ed McCanal for a suggestion. Okay, because you'd walk around slingshot. Somebody's liable to shoot you.
Like I said, I didn't know.
You come here with a machine gun.
Ed McCanal for a suggestion. Okay, because you'd walk around.
Time 5845.
Somebody's liable to shoot you.
Victor Tom
You
5845.
come here with a machine gun.
Ed McCanal for a suggestion. Okay, because you'd walk around slingshot. Somebody's liable to shoot you.
Like I said, I didn't know.
You come here with a machine gun.
Ed McCanal for a suggestion. Okay, because you'd walk around slingshot. Somebody's liable to shoot you.
Like I said, I didn't know.
You come here with a machine gun.
Ed McCanal for a suggestion. Okay, because you'd walk around slingshot. Somebody's liable to shoot you.
Like I said, I didn't know.
You come here with a machine gun.
Ed McCanal for a suggestion. Okay, because you'd walk around slingshot. Somebody's liable to shoot you.
Like I said, I didn't know.
You come here with a machine gun.
Ed McCanal for a suggestion. Okay, because you'd walk around slingshot. Somebody's liable to shoot you.
Like I said, I didn't know.
You come here with a machine gun.
Ed McCanal for a suggestion. Okay, because you'd walk around slingshot. Somebody's liable to shoot you.
Like I said, I didn't know.
You come here with a machine gun.
Ed McCanal for a suggestion. Okay, because you'd walk around.
If you're on callback, thank you.
Somebody's liable to shoot you.
You come here with a machine gun.
Ed McCanal for a suggestion. Okay, because you'd walk around slingshot. Somebody's liable to shoot you.
Like I said, I didn't know.
You come here with a machine gun.
Ed McCanal
I'm an adult female on my unit, taking her to the Hampton Inn. Getting mileage is 73003.
Like I said, I didn't know.
You come here with a machine gun.
Ed McCanal for a suggestion. Okay, because you'd walk around slingshot. Somebody's liable to shoot you.
Like I said, I didn't know.
You come here with a machine gun.
Ed McCanal for a suggestion. Okay, because you'd walk around slingshot. Somebody's liable to shoot you.
Like I said, I didn't know.
You come here with a machine gun.
Ed McCanal for a suggestion. Okay, because you'd walk around slingshot.
Madam President.
Majority Leader.
The Senate's continuing our productive summer. This week, we've been focused on confirming more of the President's qualified nominees. After his confirmation yesterday, Andrew Oldham of Texas will now bring his impressive credentials and years of distinguished public service to his new role on the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. Today, we're considering the nomination of Ryan Bounds to serve on the Ninth Circuit. Each of these nominees has been selected by the President and his team for their credentials, reputations, and commitment to the rule of law. Each has been thoroughly examined by our colleagues on the Judiciary Committee.
Ryan Bounds is no exception. He's earned degrees from Stanford and Yale. He clerked for the very Ninth Circuit judge he's been nominated to succeed. For the past 14 years, he's distinguished himself as a public servant at the Department of Justice and in his current role as an assistant U.S. attorney for Oregon. Along the way, he's earned the respect and recognition of legal professionals from across the country and the political spectrum. 46 of his colleagues in the District of Oregon describe his admirable work ethic, keen judgment, masterful writing as skills that colleagues and opponents alike seek to emulate. In a letter to our Senate colleagues from Oregon, criminal defense attorneys who've litigated against Mr. Bounds testified to his, quote, fairness, diligence, and legal acumen. They write he has shown time and time again that he's a man of his word. He's an excellent lawyer and would make an outstanding judge. A number of law professors from across the country seem to agree. They remind us of the standards to which this body is charged with holding judicial nominees: fairness, impartiality, intellectual rigor. To sum it up, in the words of one legal peer, Ryan has all of this and more. So, Madam President, I look forward to voting to confirm this excellent nominee and would urge all of my colleagues to join me. Speaking of excellent nominees, I'd like to speak for a moment about President Trump's outstanding choice for the Supreme Court, Judge Brett Kavanaugh. This week, even more of our colleagues have had the opportunity to meet with Judge Kavanaugh. I'm sure they'll agree that it's hard not to come away impressed. The academic achievement, the judicial credentials, the esteem of his peers and fellow legal professionals. Of course, that hadn't stopped the far-left special interest groups from grasping at straws and trying to smear this nominee any way they can. They don't seem to care whether it's honest or not. They don't seem to care whether it's accurate or not. The latest made-up controversy is an attempt this week to make hay out of comments Judge Kavanaugh made about the long-ago expired independent counsel statute. But once again, there's no there whatsoever. Here, Madam President, are the facts. Judge Kavanaugh's apparent concerns about the independent counsel law appear in line with mainstream views that have been widely held on both sides of the political aisle. Views that were, in fact, strongly held by many of my Democratic colleagues, at least until there was an opportunity to try to make political hay. Congress chose to let the statute expire back in 1999, based in large part on constitutional concerns. Let me say that again. The Congress in 1999, on a bipartisan basis, decided to let the independent counsel statute expire. My colleague, the senior senator from Illinois, the assistant Democratic leader in the Senate right now, explained this well when he was fighting any attempt to renew the statute. Here's what he said in 1999 about the independent counsel: unchecked, unbridled, unrestrained, and unaccountable. My friend from Illinois punctuated his enthusiasm for the demise of the independent counsel by saying, "I'd like to say to Judge Starr and all other counsels, your days are numbered." I agreed with him about the independent counsel statute. A number of us in both parties saw it the very same way. So we happily allowed the law to expire. This has nothing to do with special counsels. That's different from the independent counsel. The day the independent counsel statute expired, the day we actually finished with the impeachment trial of President Clinton here in the Senate, Senator Chris Dodd from Connecticut and I went upstairs and had a press conference and said we agree the independent counsel statute ought to be allowed to expire, and it did. That has nothing, Madam President, to do with special counsels or any of the other tools that are currently in place for elected officials to be held accountable. This has nothing to do with any investigations that are in the headlines today. Judge Kavanaugh was talking about was a law that has not existed for 2 decades and which the Supreme Court upheld with only a single dissenting vote. And one of the dissenters in the case that upheld the independent counsel statute was Justice Scalia. The irony, or hypocrisy, is that our Democratic colleagues are now criticizing Judge Kavanaugh because he may hold the same views on this subject that they did. Or at least they did up until Judge Kavanaugh was nominated. A view that was shared and acted upon by members in this body on both sides of the aisle, as I have explained. So another day, another off-base attack. Here's how Newsweek dismissed this tempest in a teapot. Law experts told Newsweek that Kavanaugh's view on independent counsels has nothing to do with special counsels or Mueller's probe. And in fact, the two types of federal investigations are completely different. Yet again, the far-left special interest groups who are desperate to deny Judge Kavanaugh fair treatment are hoping the media will buy their latest made-up charge. Remember the outrage when it was learned that Judge Kavanaugh enjoys baseball? My goodness. Shocking. Well, I'm proud the president has chosen a nominee as strong as Judge Kavanaugh. We should put aside these unfair attacks and misrepresentations and give his nomination the fair treatment it deserves. Now, on a final matter, this week I've discussed a number of converging reports that highlight the strength of this economy for middle-class families and job creators. U.S. retail sales just increased for the fifth consecutive month. Earlier this year, consumer confidence hit its highest level since...
You come here with a machine gun.
Ed, can I offer a suggestion? Okay, because you'd walk around...
909 North.
Rocket in their own cap. Administrator Jim Bridenstine on Newsmakers. The two reporters are Christian Davenport, Washington Post, Caleb Henry, Space News.
You come here with a machine gun.
Well, there are two other companies actually that are aimed at flying humans off the face of the Earth. Blue Origin and Virgin Galactic, although not just orbit, and they would do this, as a commercial venture for tourists. I wonder, as NASA administrator and as you are working toward flying NASA astronauts for the first time since the shuttle retired in 2011, does it bother you that these other companies actually might fly humans first, or do you think that's actually a really good thing?
Oh, it's a wonderful thing. So, you mentioned Virgin Galactic and you mentioned Blue Origin, and they're looking in short order on doing suborbital space flights, not just for science, which is important, but also for tourism. The more people we can get exposed to space, I think the better. And ultimately, when those capabilities become commercialized, it results in a market that enables NASA to buy those services as well. Then NASA becomes one customer of many customers, driving down our costs, increasing our access, and then again we can use taxpayer resources to do things that commercial isn't yet doing. So all of that, in my view, is very good.
So one of your commercial crew providers, Boeing, you mentioned that they're using a vehicle from the United Launch Alliance. That's powered by a Russian engine, and I believe Russia has made recent statements indicating that they may cut the supply of that engine. Does that concern you, that they might cause further delays with the Russian crew program?
Yes, in fact, the United States of America is working really hard to not be dependent on the RD-180 engine. It's also true, and I want to be really clear about this, NASA is unique from the rest of the federal government in the sense that when relations get rough between countries, when they're not so good, NASA is able to maintain that relationship. So right now we have American astronauts on the International Space Station that got there by flying on a Russian Soyuz rocket. And of course, that's an amazing relationship that is unique to NASA. And that's historical as well.
Call map to reroute you for a choking patient.
When I was in Congress,
752 Virginia Avenue, 752 Virginia Avenue.
And of course, it was signed by the president. During that time, specifically, space was carved out because we want to be able to continue to cooperate on space issues. So NASA represents an amazing soft power capability for the United States of America. When other channels of communication break down, nations can still communicate on space exploration and space discovery and science. And I think that's an amazing capability that NASA needs to preserve. So do we want to be dependent? No. Do we want to have a partnership? Absolutely. And even when we have commercial crew, which is an American rocket launching from American soil with American astronauts, which we want to, at the same time, maintain the relationship with Russia. So maybe some of their crew will launch on our rockets and our crew will launch on their rockets. The International Space Station is truly international.
9225 FPD.
NASA Administrator Jim Bridenstine joining us for this conversation on newsmakers. Caleb Henry, go ahead.
on scene requesting medics to check vitals on a subject.
On that.
Work off fire, dispatch at
head of
1440.
Roscosmos, the Russian space agency, Dmitry Rogozin, I believe that he is banned by U.S. sanctions from visiting the U.S. Have you met with him?
Not yet, but I intend to in the near future. And we're working on how do we maintain this relationship given those constraints. And I'm very confident that we'll be able to work it out.
Thank you. Question about the commercial crew program. Boeing and SpaceX flying NASA's astronauts to the space station. They've recently announced new dates for when their first flights without crew and with crew. I believe the crewed flights would be April 2019 for SpaceX, mid-2019 for Boeing. There have been repeated delays, though, and setbacks in the program. Are you confident that they're going to fly now on those dates? And if so, what gives you that confidence?
So we are confident. We did not, when you think about what commercial crew is, we did not write out, thousands of requirements and specifications for commercial crew. We do have requirements, don't get me wrong, but we wanted to provide as much leeway to the companies as possible to create their own unique designs and to be very innovative, and they have. Now, to the extent that has enabled us, it's really kind of advanced technology. It's enabled us to do more. We also have to make sure that those designs are very safe. So that's what we're working through right now. We're trying to figure out every possible way that these rockets could fail and then mitigate against those risks. And so that takes time. It's also true, and this is an important point to make, commercial crew rockets and capsules are going to be at least 3 times safer than the space shuttle. So when we talk about the amount of risk that we're taking here, commercial crew actually reduces the risk to American astronauts and our international partners. I think that's an important point to make. Why is that? It's an entirely different design. When you think about the space shuttles, there was no crew escape capability. There was no, in essence, when you think about a fighter aircraft with an ejection seat, there was no ejection capability on the space shuttle. And of course that and the design of the space shuttle itself was more risky than a simple rocket with a capsule on top. Now, I don't want to use the word simple because rockets are never simple, but it's a much simpler design than the space shuttle was. So the simpler design combined with a crew ejection capability, if you will, a crew escape capability, really increases the survivability and reduces the risk. Mr. Henry.
The Senate has proposed in the Space Frontier Act to extend the life of the International Space Station 6 years to 2030. This is beyond initial extensions to 2024 and possibly 2028. What do you think of this?
It's an interesting idea. I'll tell you what my position is and what the position of the administration is that we need to very rapidly transition low Earth orbit to commercial operation. In other words, we need to figure out how can NASA be a customer on commercial space stations in low Earth orbit rather than owning and operating the International Space Station. Now, I want to be really clear. The International Space Station has been a tremendous asset for the United States of America, and it will continue to be. The President's budget request called for a transition of the ISS in 2025. So that's 7 years from now. And the question between now and then is, what can we commercialize? And how do you create a business case for commercial entities in low Earth orbit? Could we take the International Space Station and enable, private enterprise to, in essence, take it over and close the business case? And the answer is we don't know yet, and between now and 7 years from now, it may very well be possible. Additionally, we've got companies that are building commercial space stations, commercial habitats, that are going to be separate from the International Space Station. So that enables NASA to be a customer of those commercial space stations. Reducing our costs, we become one customer of many customers, and we have multiple providers that are competing on innovation and cost. So all of those things are good. So the commercialization of low Earth orbit, in my view, should be the highest priority so that we can take NASA resources and focus on going to the moon and creating a sustainable architecture at the moon to do science, but also to do prospecting, to take advantage of the hundreds of billions of tons of water ice that we now know is on the surface of the moon. That water ice on the moon represents life support. It's water to drink. It's hydrogen and oxygen. You split it into its component parts. It's air to breathe. But it also represents propulsion and power. Liquid hydrogen, liquid oxygen is the same propellant that powered the space shuttles, for example. We want to use NASA resources to go further and do more than we've ever done before. To do that, we need to commercialize low Earth orbit. Now, if we want to extend the International Space Station, that's wonderful if we can have commercial enterprise do that. So the question is, what would that commercial enterprise be? There are a number of different companies right now that are making tremendous strides in manufacturing in low Earth orbit. The idea of manufacturing fiber optics, for example, is one commonly referred to capability. The idea that those fiber optics would be so pristine and so clear that you don't need cable repeaters, you don't need to make those massive investments every couple of miles or whatever the number is. And that closes the business case to manufacture in a microgravity environment fiber optics. The idea that in a microgravity environment, it's possible to, in essence, 3D print organs that can be used, like, for humans, which is an astonishing kind of development that is being researched right now on the International Space Station. There's so much more. Pharmaceuticals represents another great opportunity. So there's so many things that are being developed in this microgravity or almost zero gravity environment in low Earth orbit that could be commercialized, and if we can have that happen in the next 7 years, and the NASA can use resources to go further and do more, that's what we should be striving for.
Questioning the Administrator Jim Bridenstine are Christian Davenport from the Washington Post, Caleb Henry from Space News.
The White House has reconstituted the National Space Council after it had been dormant for a long time, and its first directive was a return to the moon, which is mentioned a few times. What is the architecture that's going to get us to the moon? What does it look like? Are we going to get there, and what's the timeline for that?
This show is, what, 4 hours long?
I've got a problem with my computer and my unit. It seems to be real slow getting the calls from the dispatcher.
We understand that the cost of getting to space
2 or 3
and
minute
access to
or
space
sometimes
for more
5 minute
people
delay
is
when
going
she
to be
dispatches.
better than ever before.
It just is real
That being the
sluggish.
case, we want the entire architecture between the Earth and the moon to be reusable, as launch is now reusable. That being the case, we want tugs between low Earth orbit and lunar orbit to be reusable. We want a gateway, we call it the gateway. We think of a space station in orbit around the moon that's going to use solar electric propulsion, so it will be there for a very long period of time. But the key is it's got solar electric propulsion, so it's not only going to be in what we call a near rectilinear halo orbit, it's also going to be able to go to L1 and L2. It's in essence going to be able to go to more parts of the moon than ever before from an orbitology perspective. But we also want landers to be reusable. We want landers going back and forth from that space station in orbit around the moon, back and forth to the moon many, many times. If the entire architecture is reusable, then the entire architecture is sustainable. The president said in his space policy directive, he wants a sustainable return to the moon. He doesn't want to recreate Apollo with flags and footprints, and then in 1972, after our 6th landing on the moon, we came home and we never went back. He doesn't want to do that. He wants a sustainable architecture, and he wants to utilize the resources of the moon. The water ice. There could be, and we don't know, there could be rare earth metals on the moon. We talk about rare earth metals on Earth. those aren't Earth metals at all. Those are asteroid impacts from 1 billion years ago or more. Well, the moon has the same pot marks on the moon, but it doesn't have an active geology. The hydrosphere there is much less active than that on Earth, which means there could be massive deposits of rare Earth metals, metals, if you will, or not, of course, Earth metals if they're on the moon. But that could be on the moon as well. So we need to prospect the moon. We need to understand it. There's a whole lot we don't know. From 1969 until 2008, most people believed that the moon was bone dry. 2008, the Indians made a discovery that there's water ice. 2009, NASA does its own research, discovers that there's hundreds of billions of tons of water ice at the poles of the moon. That should have changed our direction from a space perspective immediately. We should have been going back to the moon with a sustainable architecture to do the science, to do the discovery, and to ultimately be able to do more than we've ever done before. So the architecture not only gets us to the equatorial regions, which is what kind of Apollo did, it gets us to more parts of the moon than we've ever been to before, so we can make those discoveries. We should know a lot more about the moon today than we did, and we just haven't been doing it. The other thing that the moon represents, we talk about the gateway in orbit around the moon. That's to give us more access to more parts of the moon for a longer period of time than ever before. But the second gateway is a deep space transport. That's in essence our mission to Mars. So we want not only everything to be reusable, we want everything to be replicable for a Mars mission. And we want to take advantage of our commercial partners, as we've already discussed, and we want to take advantage of our international partners. So if we want to create the sustainable lunar architecture, again, we're not doing Apollo again. We're not going to, and I want to be clear, Apollo was amazing, critically important. We proved that the United States of America had a superior economic and political system, and we were superior technologically. We proved that. Now what we want to do is we want to be the only nation on the planet establishing a lunar architecture that is sustainable for the long run, that brings along with us all of our international partners and our commercial partners, again, to do more than we've ever done before. And all of this is about really one thing. That is improving the human condition on Earth. And that's what NASA is doing.
Before we wrap up, a quick word about the study of the sun that's going to take place with NASA.
A wonderful question. So the Parker Solar Probe is very soon going to launch, and this is going to enable us to know more about the sun. We talk about a Carrington level event, so a coronal mass ejection coming out of the sun. We're talking about charged particles coming out of the sun in mass quantities very, very fast. And that can damage humans in space because it's just a lot of radiation, if you will.
Thank you so much.
On top of that, it can damage our satellites, it can mess with our power grid. A Carrington level event, which happened in the 1800s, if it happened today, it could be a civilization damaging kind of event. So we've got to be prepared for that. What we're going to understand with Parker Solar Probe is which is a mission to the sun, as you identify. It's crazy to think about, but a mission to the sun. We're going to work to be able to predict those kind of events and mitigate against them here on Earth.
Jim Brenstein, the NASA administrator, joining us for this edition of Newsmakers. We appreciate your time today.
Thank you very much.
We'll be right back.
Moderator is C-SPAN's Pedro Echevarria.
Christian Davenport from the administrators talk. Commercial came up time and again. It seems to be the name of the game at NASA's. Did you walk away with that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, he has come into office, and the Trump administration has really tried to embrace this growing space industry. You've heard the president talk about, these billionaires and their rockets referring to Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos and others. And, they're now providing a critical service for NASA, flying cargo and supplies to the International Space Station. But soon, as early as next year, NASA is going to be entrusting the lives of its astronauts to these companies, counting on them to fly to the International Space Station. But what was really interesting about what the administrator said was, Caleb asked a really smart question, I thought, about the Space Launch System. This is the massive rocket that Boeing and other more traditional companies are building, and it's come under real scrutiny because of its cost and schedule delays, but also now that you've got this growing industry, they're also building heavy lift rockets. What does it mean for the future of SLS? And he
She's requesting law
embraced
enforcement
that,
because
given
she's still on the
chance. I mean,
roadway
he
at a
said,
traffic
no,
light.
we
Her
need
vehicle
that
died. She's
now,
unable
but
to
he
move it.
also left open the possibility that should other rockets come on the market, that, you know, he's all for an open competition between these companies because, in his view, that'll only benefit NASA.
And Mr. Henry, what else did you take away from those responses, particularly to the rocket side of it?
I thought the SLS comment was really important, certainly. Up until before SpaceX had launched their Falcon Heavy rocket this February, there was a lot of speculation as to whether or not SLS would be necessary, but you couldn't really compare it because neither rocket had flown. Now that Falcon Heavy has flown, you do have evidence of a heavy lift vehicle of that capability in the U.S. Alongside the Delta Heavy. We've got strong rockets here, and the fact that NASA's willing to embrace those.
Well, let me open up that one first.
You talked about the confidence of putting humans into these rockets. Is that an accurate reflection? Is NASA confident in the ability of these commercial rockets to safely carry people to space?
I believe yes. NASA's standards are world-renowned. They're very serious about safety. I think it was really interesting hearing about his experience being a pilot. It's certainly top of mind, safety of the astronauts, and these companies are being put through rigorous tests to make sure that their vehicles are up to par.
Mr. Davenport?
Yeah, well, they don't have a choice. I mean, you know, these contracts are out the door. The spacecraft are being developed. You know, right now, NASA does not have the ability to fly astronauts into space, and hasn't had that capability since 2011 when the space shuttle was retired. A lot of people don't realize NASA's astronauts still fly to space. They still go to the International Space Station, but they do it on Russian rockets. Now, Boeing and SpaceX are trying to restore that capability for NASA and developing their vehicles, but, you know, the programs have been delayed, but right now NASA doesn't have a choice. They've got to get these spacecraft and these rockets up and running.
He spoke in optimistic terms of going to the moon, going to Mars. What's the reality of either of those things happening?
You know, I mean, the Mars is always, you know, 20 to 30 years down the road, and it's been that way for a long time. I think a return to the moon is more realistic, but whether, you know, when I asked the question about it, we didn't get a real sense of the timeline and when this is going to happen. I mean, they talk about putting a propulsion element of this gateway up in the early 2020s, and I know they're working on a lunar lander proposal now. It does seem like it's a more achievable and reasonable goal, and the way they're thinking about it, again, as the administrator said, it's not to just go there, touch the moon, walk around on it and leave, but to build a sustainable architecture so that you can actually stay there and be there, you know, for some time, just as we have a presence in low Earth orbit on the International Space Station, extend that to the region of the moon.
And Mr. Henry, you talked a little bit about the future relations we'll have with Russia and China, especially as we take on more of an American role. What's the reality of the future relations with those countries, particularly when it comes to space?
So, as you mentioned, the space has been a special area that has been carved out when there are tough times, and the U.S.-Russia relationship in space has been very strong. He's talking positively about making the lunar gateway something that also has a lot of international representation, but I think it's clear that international partners are concerned that America is much more concerned about focusing on going to the moon, and he's certainly spoken against that, but when I've talked to people in the European industry, the Europeans work very closely with NASA in space, and they've definitely evidenced that they're working in the U.S. for share some of the responsibilities that they've
Caleb Henry is a staff writer for Space News, and Christian Davenport is the Space and Defense Industries reporter for the Washington Post. To both of you, thanks for joining us on Newsmaker.
Thanks for having us.
C-SPAN Radio, WCSP-FM, Washington. Next, a conversation with Supreme Court Justice Stephen Breyer, recorded at the Aspen Institute in Colorado. Justice Breyer spoke with WMU radio host Joshua Johnson about the Constitution, the law, and his future on the Supreme Court. This event was part of an Aspen Institute speaker series and runs an hour long. Joshua Johnson begins.
Thank you very much. Good evening.
Running people off the road.
Thank you all for being here, especially those of you who may well have been impacted by this fire. We certainly wish you all the best as the firefight continues. I appreciate you making time for us. I hope that this conversation with Justice Breyer will be time well spent. We'll look forward to getting to some of your questions a little bit later on in this conversation. We have about 55 minutes to get done what we're going to do, both here, online, and on Aspen Public Radio, but I work in radio. We can do a lot in 55 minutes. Justice Breyer, welcome.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to come out here. I love it here. I'm sorry about the fire.
So everybody back in D.C. wants me to ask one thing.
Yes, that's right.
I don't know if you know what that is, or... But just to make him crazy, I'm not going to start with that. Yes, I know, see? We'll get to that. I promise we'll get to that. But I wanted to get to something first that we discussed a few minutes ago before we stepped out here. You came here today with something you had written down, a paragraph. I won't ask you to read the whole thing, but I wonder if I could prevail upon you to read just that first section of it as it relates to some of your legal philosophy.
Well, let's explain.
Yeah, explain where it comes from, and I love it.
This is more difficult for me to use because of what's going on in Washington. So I have to look at how can I appear to say something while in fact saying the most boring thing I could possibly invent. And even then it might not work. But we know, because if the Republican newspapers say I'm favoring or not favoring Republicans, or the Democratic newspapers say the same thing in respect to their party and whatever part, etc., then we know I've done it wrong. But if in the end of 55 minutes every single one of you is asleep, perfect. That's basically the idea. Right. Now, I wrote down, I said, what is law? I told him about what we were talking about, what is a great tradition in law, and that's a tradition I think that I ascribe to. It's gone on for 100 years. And it's that law is complicated, is what it comes down to. It's pragmatic, it's adaptive, it proceeds slowly over time, and if you're a judge, you have to look at cases, and you have to read the words, and you have to try to figure out what institutions, bankruptcy is in fact an institution, and so is ERISA. And ERISA, don't ask me to explain it, because you will be asleep at the end of the time. All right, but they serve human beings. And so you are aware of the long time frame. You are aware that what you are deciding in a case is not just for these people in front of you, nor just for the judges who probably have come to different conclusions about it now. It will last. It's for the other judges who will have to follow what you say. It is for lawyers who will have to explain it to clients. It is for clients who will, in fact, have to live with it. And indeed, it's for a lot of people who have never seen a law office, because they will be affected by it. Now, all that comes in. Does it all come in every case? In a sense, yes. Does a judge think about it in every case? Not unless he's Superman or something. I mean, you can. But in some cases, certain aspects are more prominent than in others, and so it's complex. That's the idea. And there will be change. If there were no change, we're frozen to death in the 18th century or earlier. And if there is too much change, people can't adapt. They don't know how to lead their lives. And that's why we have principles that say go slowly. And there we are.
Yeah, there's one phrase in particular in what you've written that has to do with the law as being something, part of a tradition that is pragmatic, undogmatic, and adaptive.
Yes. I
wonder how you view, in light of that, how you view this time in our nation's civic life, because there seems to be very little in our public discourse that is pragmatic or undogmatic or adaptive. We feel like the gears are just grinding all of the time, whereas you're part of an institution that is designed to just function despite the difficulties of opinion, despite the differences of perspective. As someone who sits in that august institution, how do you view this moment in civic life?
Well, let's go back. When you say this moment, let's go back, and I'll ask, at least rhetorically, in the 1830s or 1840s, when there was a legal question about the federal government. No, it was Georgia, actually. Let's say what it was. It was Georgia. They found gold. The land that they found it on belonged to the Cherokees, and so they took it. Because after all, they thought, why should the Indians have this gold? Why shouldn't we? We are Georgians, and they are not. And law cases were brought. And they, Indians, naturally won. Totally wrong. And the President of the United States, Andrew Jackson, said John Marshall, the Supreme Court Chief Justice, has made his decision, now let him enforce it. And he sent troops, but not to enforce the decision, but rather to drive out the Indians to Oklahoma, where they live in the state. So, was that a period that was, would you say, what were the words?
Pragmatic.
Charlie, one second. Copy, plate if you haven't got it yet. Henry Sam, George, 6300. Or let's go through the Civil War days. Or let's go through the Civil War days. Or let's go through Reconstruction. Or let's go through 80 years, just about, of legal segregation. And do you think those were days that were what? Pragmatic, adaptive? Well, they were adaptive. I didn't see it.
4021 Wood River at the Wood River Apartments.
History in the United States. And some of it has turned out pretty well, and some of it has not. And the amazing thing about it, I think, is what Tocqueville said in about 1840, when he came over here, and he said the first thing he noticed was the clamor. Huh? What's that noise? What did he mean by that? He said what he meant. He meant the clamor of every group under the sun, trying to work out their differences, and maybe they should have been more polite about it, but they had institutions that helped them work things out. There were police associations, there were civil liberties associations, there was this one, there was that one, there were newspapers. Try reading the newspapers then. And there were legislatures of states and city councils and everything under the sun. And what we tended to do was we took all kinds of different views and then we tried to work something out. And some worked better and some didn't. And our job on the Supreme Court then, and I think it's just as now, when it's best, it comes in last. Why? Because I hate to tell you, we are not great experts on all these different subjects, but we can look at what other people have decided to do about such matters as privacy and the internet. We can look at that, and we can take this document, and we can say, this document, the Constitution, creates frontiers. They create boundaries.
No, you're supposed to come into
from
Weber.
Whether this particular solution that's in front of us has crossed the boundary.
All the way, if you come into the Weber, or you can come into one of those streets like Lamont or something like that, and just cross that onto Caroline, go directly across. But if not, the easier way is just to Weber, and you turn onto Galahad towards Caroline, and at the light you can turn left. It's a one-way, only left.
Institute in Colorado.
I imagine it's a lot better than using it.
Well, I say that to students at Stanford, and you want a tough one. I get this question. What about Bush v. Gore? Yeah. Right. And I quote to them what Harry Reid said in the hall of my building, the Supreme Court, when we were at dinner. He said the most remarkable thing about that case was something it's hardly ever remarked. Despite the fact that it was important, it was unpopular. I say at least with half, maybe a few more than half, but or at least, and I thought it was wrong. I was in dissent, okay? Despite that, fine. That's how I actually feel about most of my dissents. But the fact is, despite that, people followed it. And I have my Stanford audience. I know what they're thinking. I know right now when I say that at least 20% of you are thinking too bad there were a few guns and stones or something. And I say, I know that's what you're thinking. So turn on the television set. And see what happens in countries that decide their big problems and differences that way. I don't think it's so bad. 2401
Root Street, 2401 Root Street, cross street of 21st Street. It's going to be a 55-year-old female, conscious and breathing. Information still coming in, work off EMS 1, 1509.
With this basic document. Even if I disagree with the result, and I do not disagree with every result. That's a false rumor. I disagree with some results, right? As does everyone. Okay, so that gives you a picture. Complicated, pragmatic, institutional, just slowly over time, not always, but mostly. And we're in there for the long run, and we are the border patrol. And you keep all those things in mind, and think about them while you're asleep, all right?
No, they're quite awake. When you do write a dissent, how do you view your role as a dissenter on the court? What's the value to you for posterity of being someone who says, yeah, that's what the majority thinks, but I think they're wrong, here's why?
That is a very, very good question. And there are different kinds of dissent. And the best kind of dissent is you're writing a dissent to try to convince someone who tentatively, because it's always tentative until the last minute, on the other side. And you're saying, you see it this way. See it this way. That's why. And nobody who writes an opinion likes to look like an idiot. So if you have a good argument there, they'll change it. And how much will they change it? And to what extent? And will the whole thing change? And that's always up for grabs. And so the best kind of dissent is where you feel you're doing that, you're going to point something out, you have a hope here of at least a major change for the future, even if they don't join you. Now it gets more complicated. What about a constitutional provision? Well, maybe you have disabled veterans because the Constitution changes somewhat more quickly than statute, because Congress can't do anything about the Constitution, you see, so we're the only ones who can do something about it, and therefore we're a little bit more open to change. Maybe yeah, and you write it. You say, why doesn't the world have the benefit of my wonderful writing? There is an element of that, and that is actually institutionally relevant. Well, but what about a statute? I mean, this is the hardest one for me. A statute. I'm in the dissent. I can write what I want. I've got all my changes made. I'm not going to get any better. From my point of view, this majority. Do I write something? Publish it? Well,
you come here with a machine gun.
There are sort of arguments one way and arguments the other way.
Cross street of Casper Street.
Arguments one way, even so, you've put it way here of
11512.
deciding a case that people may eventually, even if they change this case, they don't want to change the case, but they will see how you do it, and that might help some people. Or maybe you want to say, be a voice that some people will say, well, at least there were some in there who really saw the point. They'll think, if they agree with you. On the other hand, or you could say, let this one pass. And if you look back to the period with Holmes, early part of the 20th century, that happened a lot. 19th century happened a lot. People say, well, let it pass. Congress can change it. I can't do anything, really. I won't write a dissent.
So kind of the legal philosophy around dissent has changed.
I think it has. I think there are more of them. And now, what's wrong with writing dissent? You've got all the arguments in your head, put it down. Well, the more 5-4s, the more dissents. What are you doing? Trickle, 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 trickle. To what is a great need, and that is a need for confidence in the institution.
Does that mean that since you mentioned 5-4s, does the court try not to end up with 5-4s? Like, is there an effort to try to have 7-2-8-1?
I think there is. I think there is. Now you can say, how much? Shouldn't it be more? And if you're in the 4, you certainly think it should be more. and you think, well, why is it so important to try to get more together? And the obvious example, think of what Earl Warren did to try to get 9 people on that opinion, Brown versus Board of Education. ending segregation. He thought that was pretty important. And think of what happened after that. 1954, the opinion came down. And you know what happened in 1955? Yes, nothing. That's right, nothing. And 1956? Yeah. Nothing. Yeah. And I remember impeach Earl Warren sign all over the South. And yeah. And I remember Little Rock. Not everyone can remember that now, particularly when I'm talking to a college audience. So you better read about it. You better learn about it. You better learn how a judge said, yes, now is the time, and to integrate that Central High School. And Governor Faubus got out in front of the school with the White Citizens Council and said, no. He said, the judge has an order, but I have the state police. And you remember, I remember, and they should see it, Elizabeth Eckford reading that book. Black girl trying to go into the white school, turned away, and she's reading like this with her book, and the girl behind her, her face contorted with anger at the thought of a black child going into the school. And to end that, Eisenhower had to send 1,000 paratroopers, which was not such an easy decision at that time, because he was told by Jimmy Burns, former Supreme Court justice, resigned to run our war effort. Moderate on race, governor of South Carolina. He said, Mr. President, if you send troops to Little Rock, you better be prepared to occupy the entire South. You better be prepared for a second Reconstruction. But Herbert Brownell said to the president, send them. It's a question of the rule of law. Do it. And he did it. 1,000 from Fort Bragg, the 101st Airborne, and everybody knew who they were. They were the people who hung up on those church steeples at Normandy and had fought the Battle of the Bulge, and they went there and took those children by the hand and walked into the white school. All right? But they couldn't stay. What?
Since you brought up the relationship between the court and the public in Brown v. Board, I wonder if we could come forward to the relationship today, sort of by way of talking about Justice Kennedy and the nomination that'll be announced on Monday. I wonder how you see the public's relationship with the Supreme Court. It seems like many people who are the most passionate about whoever this nominee is going to be, and I don't want you to stray into territory you can't discuss regarding the nominee or the process, but it feels like a lot of people have a real dog in this fight. They want something from the Supreme Court, and they want someone who's going to give it to them. But that's not really the court's job. The court's job is to kind of wrestle with whatever legal questions come before it in a thoughtful and a fair manner, but try to let the people who are fired up about Roe v. Wade, or Hobby Lobby, or Obamacare, or same-sex marriage, or, you know, the travel ban. How do you see the public's relationship with the Supreme Court today? Do people really get what your job is?
Radio host Joshua Johnson in a conversation with Supreme Court Justice Stephen Breyer.
I wish Sandra O'Connor were here, and I really do. I loved her, and I did. And I think we should say, and Tony too, Tony Kennedy, and me, and probably everybody. This is the most significant thing we can do is to encourage, we were talking about this at lunch, people to teach civics in the high school, because they have to know what we do.
Put him on your... Yes.
And I say that if you say, I'll get to today, I can get at least to today, I'd say 4 years ago from today. Because in my office, I think 4 years ago or 5 years ago, asking the same question. You see, was the president, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And she was trying to make a tremendous effort. She's been somewhat successful to bring civil rights and the democratic processes into that Ghanaian government to see what they stick. And she said, why do people do what you say?
Why do people do what you say?
Yeah.
You mean, like, why do people abide by Supreme Court?
Yeah, that's right. Why? And that's why I brought up Little Rock. Because there's no good answer to that. There's no single sentence that answers that. We are 9 people. Because after those paratroopers were there, the day came when they left. And on that day, Governor Faubus, they passed a new board resolution saying resegregate. And that went to the Supreme Court, Cooper versus Aaron. And in Cooper versus Aaron, all 9 said integrate. And you know what happened? He closed the schools. That's what happened. I told her that. And I said, yeah, close the school. But it didn't last. I said, in my opinion, why didn't it last? Because by that time, we had the bus boycott, we had Martin Luther King, we had the Freedom Riders, we had all kinds of people who, and contrary to popular belief, I've said this 5 million times, of our 320 million people in America, 319 million are not judges or lawyers. And those are the people, those are the ones that you have to convince that it is worth having judges whom you will follow when you disagree. And that was, in fact, that was Harry Reid's point. And that's the point I want to make to the Stanford students. It's so easy to say follow when you agree. And it's a little tougher when you don't.
Can I ask you about something that's one of these, let me shift gears a little bit to one of these recent legal controversies that I think a lot of people have been following quite a bit as it relates to the relationship between the public and the Supreme Court. There have been a number of recent decisions that have been written in a fairly narrowly tailored way, dealing with some big issues. The gerrymandering decisions in Wisconsin and Maryland, for example. And in those cases, a lot of people really wanted the court to definitively answer the question of whether designing political districts to advantage one party over another is constitutional or not. And the court hasn't answered that. And I guess I understand why, but that's the question that we were dying to know. We don't really care about Maryland or Wisconsin as much as we care about this larger legal question. I think I speak for a lot of Americans when I ask you in that regard, what were you waiting for? Why not just answer the question if you know that's what we need?
I'm not talking about this particular case.
Nobody should have an ID
but I
card.
will remind you, go back in general.
Anyway, last name Garcia.
There are a lot of cases where people see the law and they understand how you might deal with it in this situation. If you go back to a case of your subject called V, you will see that 4 of us thought that there were standards to govern such things, which is the problem. And each of the 4 of us had a different standard. So Nino, who was writing the dissent, I really miss Nino, he was great. And he was. We used to debate these things, and we'd go to high schools or colleges, and we'd talk about our different points of view, and I think they come away feeling we were friends, and they came away feeling that the institution makes more sense than they had thought, perhaps previously. And that was a good thing to do. I'm so glad we did it. But he couldn't resist saying this. The dissenters all think we can have standards, and they each have different ones. So I said, well, yeah, but maybe one of them will work. That got nowhere, of course. So my point is really this. You have individual cases. You have people who make things different things, and you try to work it out. And working it out is complex. And that's why we started with this little insight into how complex it can be. And there isn't a simple, short answer to that. And that's why you read the opinions, you see what they say, you get an idea how different ones of us feel, and then we go on to the next case.
Ocean and Levy on a personalized plate.
And
Mary Union, Tom
Zebra. In Ghana, I wanted to say to her,
Mary Union, Tom Zebra.
But this is a worthwhile institution. It's worth having these 9 unelected people or more unelected people sometimes say things that you think are important, absolutely wrong, and yet that's their view of it, and then you do it. Oh dear. But until you get them convinced that it's worth having an institution like that, it's called the rule of law, you won't have it. And while you were talking, because he's interested in theater, and just like or we're talking about literature or something. It's true. It made me think of Ben Bold, famous. He says, and he has, who's the Lord Chancellor, you know, who, the Lord Chancellor in England, who was Henry VIII's Lord Chancellor. And, thank you. See, that's what I need now. If you were in the conference room, I would have no problem. I just asked you. That's true. But it was Thomas More. And the line that resonates with every one of us in the law is where he says, yes, and when those trees are all cut down, then we're
that name either. I also ran him in Eileen.
That is
nothing
the law.
showing there.
And that is the rule of law he's trying to follow. And that's the question. And until people think that it's more important, you can't say, you never say, maybe there's a thing. But until you think it's more important to have all those stuff down, you better stick to the rule of law. If you want to know what good that's doing you, you better get Sandra O'Connor back on the bandwagon here and get that taught in the high schools.
Let me ask you about something you mentioned in your latest book. It's called The Court and the World, American Law and the New Global Realities. You reference the Roman statesman Cicero, who wrote, and I'm translating, when the cannons roar, the laws fall silent, referring to the powers of government during national security crises and wars and other exigencies. These days we hear a lot about the Supreme Court dealing with domestic controversies like gerrymandering, like healthcare. You write about the court's role in dealing with international challenges, and I wonder how you see the frontier of that, particularly as we as a nation deal with how to deal with non-state actors, foreign terrorists, where the rule of law deals with the power of the presidency and the executive in a whole new frontier, in situations that we're not familiar with. How do you see the court dealing with that?
What I wanted to do in that book
is going to be at 608-1010 and 608-1010. Possible
to the reader
29 to 50.
What the world is like as a justice in this institution, the Supreme Court, in a particular aspect, namely, that lots of our cases, in order to decide them correctly under American law, require us to know something about what's going on beyond our shores. And it doesn't take much to think of that. You can think of diseases that might spread. You can think of environmental problems. You can think of business problems all over the place. You can think of civil rights and civil liberties, which is where you're going. And after all, the problem arises because the Constitution gives the power to make us secure to the President, and to the Congress, not to the court, that knows very little about that, not to the court, but the court does have power to protect civil liberty. So what do we do when these two things clash? And even there, I thought if we're going to be involved in this kind of project, we better know something about it. And we better know what other countries do. And many are, they are democracies too. And so even there, the need to know something about what's happening abroad creeps in and is important. The particular quote from Cicero, which was something like Legas Sealand or something. Yeah, that's all right, don't. But I translated it for a long time. I said it just like you said it. I said, when the cannons roar, the laws fall silent. But the problem is I was once talking to an audience about that, and they said, don't you know the Romans didn't have cannons? So there I was stuck. But nonetheless, the point was made. And so this court stayed out of it. And go back and look and see what happened. The Alien and Sedition Act. The courts weren't involved. Or the Civil War. They had a big problem like this. And it's hardly surprising the court didn't get involved really until the war was over. Which is easy then. And think of Korematsu. You know, the Japanese, 70,000 Americans. Yeah. Yeah, and it goes to the court in 44. In 42, I'm from San Francisco. I can remember the blackout shades. Maybe in 42, General Witt, who was in the 6th Army, I'd have thought that there'd be an invasion. But by 44, nobody thought that. It was pretty clear they didn't have any evidence.
You come here with a machine gun.
MEChANiCAL for suggestion. Okay.
Tell somebody else.
You come here with a machine gun.
Yeah. Okay. Well, go read the Guantanamo cases.
Somebody's liable to shoot you. Like I said, I didn't know.
You come here with a machine gun.
MEChANiCAL for suggestion.
Off, Mr. Roy Garcia? Yeah, I had already dropped him off. When I stowed the ramp, that's when she lost the air pressure.
Okay. If you walk around a slingshot, somebody's liable to shoot you. Like I said, I didn't know.
You come here with a machine gun.
MEChANiCAL for suggestion.
That means we're in the business.
Somebody's liable to shoot you. Like I said, I didn't know.
You come here with a machine gun.
MEChANiCAL for suggestion. Okay. If you walk
Went through it all, man.
somebody's liable to shoot you. Like I said, I didn't know.
Okay, this RT will be standing by in that silver vehicle with a friend, waiting for county. Show me clear.
Like I said, I didn't know.
You come here with a machine gun.
Adam 340 clear.
34360 for assisted pickup property, 105 Spurwood Street. Thank Dave.
You come here with a machine gun.
MEChANiCAL for suggestion. Okay. Because you'd walk around a slingshot. Somebody's liable to shoot you. Like I said, I didn't know.
You come here with a machine gun.
MEChANiCAL for suggestion. Okay. Because you'd walk around a slingshot. Somebody's liable to shoot you. Like I said, I didn't know.
You come here with a machine gun.
MEChANiCAL for suggestion.
Brush should be full.
You'd walk around a slingshot.
3-4 leaving brush, there's still 2 behind me.
You come here with a machine gun.
MEChANiCAL for suggestion. Okay. Because you'd walk around a slingshot. Somebody's liable to shoot you. Like I said, I didn't know.
You come here with a machine gun.
MEChANiCAL for suggestion. Okay. Because you'd walk around a slingshot. Somebody's liable to shoot you. Like I said, I didn't know.
You come here with a machine gun.
To the mansion on a warrant. 3250 to the mansion, 10-4.
You come here with
4928 traffic.
28 location.
3500 South Alameda. David King Henry 8653.
3500 South Alameda, David King Henry, 8653, 10-4.
Like I said, I didn't know.
You come here with a machine gun.
MEChANiCAL for suggestion. Okay. Because you'd walk around a slingshot. Somebody's
Give me
liable.
1 second, I'll get it off your screen.
You come here with a machine gun.
And you need to put a van thing on there so that it goes to the van.
Somebody's liable to shoot you. Like I said, I didn't know.
You come here with a machine gun.
I took care of that part already.
You'd walk around. Somebody's liable to shoot you.
Man, I'm sorry, David.
You come here with a machine gun.
MEChANiCAL for suggestion.
Tune
Okay.
in
Because
on
you'd walk
this
around a slingshot.
Monday afternoon.
Somebody's
Hope
liable to
you're doing
shoot you.
well.
Like I said, I didn't know.
You come here with a machine gun.
Have Steely Dan with Black Cow up next, but after that, we will get the update on everything that's going on.
70 and 270, contact Gina. This is a white male with curly brown hair, wearing gloves, black shirt, pants. He made a cap behind the dumpster.
You come here with a machine gun.
Delta 160 for suspicious subject. 614 Furman.
Somebody's liable to shoot you. Like I said, I didn't know.
You come here with a machine gun.
MEChANiCAL for suggestion. Okay. Because you'd walk around a slingshot. Somebody's liable to shoot you. Like I said, I didn't know.
You come here with a
Black
machine
tank
gun.
top.
MEChANiCAL for suggestion.
And a white male with a shaved head, red shirt, black shorts. And collecting items from the dumpster. Last seen on Concord
You
towards
come here
Furnace.
with a machine gun.
MEChANiCAL for suggestion. Okay. You'd walk around a slingshot. Somebody's liable to shoot you. Like I said, I didn't know.
You come here with a machine gun.
MEChANiCAL for suggestion. Okay. Because you'd walk around a slingshot.
They were able to get the vehicle off the roadway.
Like I said, I didn't know.
You come here with a machine gun.
MEChANiCAL for suggestion. Okay. Because you'd walk around a slingshot. Somebody's liable to shoot you. Like I said, I didn't know.
You come here with a machine gun.
MEChANiCAL for suggestion.
330
Because you'd walk around a slingshot.
Adam 335, please show us signal 4 7800
With a machine
Bearden.
gun.
MEChANiCAL for suggestion. Because you'd walk around a slingshot. Somebody's liable to shoot you. Like I said, I didn't know.
You come here with a machine gun.
MEChANiCAL for suggestion. Okay.
Oh, Charlie?
You'd walk around a slingshot.
Yes, ma'am, you should be clear. Vehicle off the roadway.
Like I said, I didn't know.
You come here with a machine gun.
MEChANiCAL for suggestion. Okay. Because you'd walk around a slingshot. somebody's liable to shoot you. Like I said, I didn't know
You come here with a machine gun.
Okay? Because you'd walk around with a slingshot. Somebody's liable to shoot you. Like I said, I didn't know.
You come here with a machine gun.
Okay?
Ride with the subject.
Last name spelling Boy Adam Sam, Paul Edward David. First name Clifton. Black male, date of birth is 10/21 of 88.
10/21 of 88, last name Fastfed. Can you spell the first name?
Charles Lincoln, Ida Frank, Tom Ocean Nora.
You come here with a machine gun.
There, LP.
David Keith Henry, 8653.
David Keith Henry, 8653, 10.7.
Okay? Because you'd walk around with a slingshot. Somebody's liable to shoot you. Like I said, I didn't know.
You come here with a machine gun.
MEChANiCAL for suggestion. Okay? Because you'd walk around with a slingshot. Somebody's liable to shoot you. Like I said, I didn't know.
You come here with a machine gun.
MEChANiCAL for suggestion. Okay? Because you'd walk around with a slingshot. Somebody's liable to shoot you. Like I said, I didn't know.
You come here with a machine gun.
Okay? Because you'd walk around with a slingshot. Somebody's liable to shoot you. Like I said, I didn't know.
You come here with a machine gun.
MEChANiCAL for suggestion. Okay? Because you'd walk around with a slingshot. Somebody's liable to shoot you. Like I said, I didn't know.
You come here with a machine gun.
MEChANiCAL for suggestion. Okay? Because you'd walk around with a slingshot. Somebody's liable to shoot you. Like I said, I didn't know.
You come here with a machine gun.
MEChANiCAL for suggestion. Okay? Because you'd walk around with a slingshot. Somebody's liable to shoot you. Like I said, I didn't know.
You come here with a machine
So we're
gun.
getting any kind of information. I don't think he's being honest with me. He says he was arrested 2 years ago, family violence, and he was living in the housing projects.
Tell me why they're wrong below.
I don't know if that
I
helps you
read
or
the
not.
question. I think I know the answer.
Nicholas,
Then I read it.
look that up, please.
Yeah, I did know the answer.
Stand by in line.
Then I read the bread brief. Oh. Perhaps it wasn't as clear as I thought. And then I read the yellow the reply brief. And then the government might send a brief in, which is gray. The government's always gray. And then we might have light green, or any group. It's for the petitioner, or dark green, or the respondent. And by the time I'm finished reading them, I then go to my law clerk, and I say, these are the problems that are bothering me, write a memo. Put in anything else you want.
White
Read the memo,
color, last word
I'll
has been
talk to my law clerk,
3612.
and then we have oral argument. So oral argument is really after we've read this thing pretty thoroughly and gotten memos and thought about it. And then the oral argument, half an hour each side, is for us to ask questions
Registration
primarily.
expires
And the
July
plural,
of 2019.
I mean, it is
Also showing
tough.
confirmed insurance.
And we are not really unfortunate. I think it should be longer so we can be more polite, but there's always the theory that if it's longer, we'll just be longer not polite. But nonetheless, you ask some questions. A good question is really going to shed light on how you're thinking about it. Not to show you know something. You have a funny joke or something. I plead guilty to sometimes doing it wrong. But don't. And try and get this right. And then after we've heard the oral argument and been through it, we have a day or so to think about it. And then we're in the conference, and in the conference around the table, it begins with the chief. He says, we each have a book referring to the other persons, and on each case, and the chief says the issue is and this is what I think, and then it goes to Justice Kennedy, and then it goes to Justice Thomas, and Ginsburg, and me, and Alito, and Sotomayor, and Kagan, and Gorsuch. And nobody speaks twice, so everybody's spoken once, and then there's back and forth. And then, and only then, do we have an inkling of how people are tending. And then the chief assigns the opinion if he's in the majority, so it evens out over the year, and then you start writing. And that means long memos from the clerks, it means lots of work at the word processor, it means draft and draft and draft, and then you send it around, and you see what the others think, and they'll send you memos. And you might change things, probably will. And eventually everybody's settled down. Maybe unanimous, one opinion, or maybe that opinion and a dissent, or maybe two dissents. Eventually everybody's written or joined. And that's it. It comes out. That's the system. Much more ... than you might think. And that's the job. And it isn't sitting there thinking what fun it would be to decide this case. Never. And it isn't just trying to get your views on. No, it isn't. The job, that's why I started with this stuff. Law is a very big, complicated business around a long time, with institutions, lots of cases, lots of different human needs, sometimes in conflict, sometimes reflected in the institutions, sometimes requiring some change, sometimes not. It's messy, and you're tapering at the edges almost all the time.
Before we go to audience questions, I would ask you one thing about Justice Kennedy, because I know I have made you wait. You have waited very good. I don't think that most of the American people, or many, let's just say, of the American people, have an appreciation for all of what you just described, for how thick the deliberative process is. Particularly now that we're waiting on the president to nominate a successor to Justice Kennedy. I wonder what you would like the American people to keep in mind about the Supreme Court as we think about its future. Of course, there are certain issues that people want the court to rule on, questions we want the court to answer, ways we want the court to answer those questions. Your job is, and the job of all our justices, is thoroughly deliberative in ways that I don't think many Americans really have wrapped their heads around. What do you want us as the American people to keep in mind about the court, the seat, the process, as we wait for this nomination?
One thing is that this document it lays out some frontiers. Some of them pretty important frontiers, free speech and so forth. But within those frontiers, which are broad, people make up their own minds. And that's why you don't like what's going on, you go to the ballot box. I'm afraid that's almost everything.
Date of birth 10/30 of 89.
I'd also like secondarily people to realize that it is a long deliberative process. When I first went to the court, I grew up in San Francisco. I lived most of my life in Massachusetts. I'd run into differences among people. But I never saw differences until I got to Washington. There were really differences. Okay, and first I thought, why doesn't everybody agree with me, who am so wonderfully reasonable? And then after a time, I thought, no, it's a big country.
500 South Alameda, Charles Paul 8, William 326.
My mother used to say, and every one of them holds some different opinion. There's no opinion so odd that there isn't somebody who doesn't hold it. And she used to say they all live in Los Angeles. That's because we live in San Francisco. But nonetheless, forget that inter-rivalry. But nonetheless, we have a system here that does not work perfectly. But it is a system where long-term we're trying to get something to work.
Well, we're picking up all along the back.
Complicated, multi-institutional body called law. And we're not always going to agree. But when people ask me, what am I going to do over the next few years? I say, I'll tell you what, I'm going to do my job. That's what my father would have told me. He would have said, do your job. Do your job. I tell that to the high school kids. What should we do in order to, well, I know what to do. I say, I'll tell you what my father said, do your job. And if you do it well, somebody might notice, and if not, you're still left with the sensation you did your job.
Subject joining. Shows to be on a traffic stop of 100 blocks, Louisiana westbound. Subject description, white visor, red shirt, running northbound.
I see that job. And we're all good friends. There is no personal hostility
among the justices.
No. There just isn't. And you can be as opposite ends as can be on an issue, and when you're up there at lunch, fine. You are back, and there is civility, and I've never heard a voice raised in anger in that conference room. I have never heard one person made some kind of a cracked or slighting remark about the other. It's professional. You go around the table, you discuss it on the merits, and you try to do your job.
It never got heated?
Heated. Okay. Heated.
Or uncivil, I should say. It never got uncivil?
Heated. If I feel heated, and I might, in some case, the thing for me to do is to sit there like this, and immediately I felt heated.
WAMU radio host Joshua Johnson in a conversation with Supreme Court Justice Stephen Breyer at the Aspen Institute.
You clearly handle your heat better than a lot of people, I think. That you can do it with that kind of a Vulcan of fun. I think I'm upset. Let's get to a few audience questions. Please, we do have a few minutes. If you would, when we move the mics around, I think we have a mic there and there. When I call on you, just introduce yourself, your name, where you're from. If you're with an organization, tell us which. And then your efficiently worded questions so we can hear from as many of you as possible. Let's start with you, and then we'll move that mic over to you, sir. Again, just introduce yourself, your name, where you're from, and then what's on your mind.
Hi, I'm John Aaron. I'm from Baltimore, Maryland, teaching an independent school in the area. And Justice Breyer, my question is, how do you deal with the subjectivity of God when it's a word specifically, as in a Pledge of Allegiance case, or when God kind of comes in the back door when it comes to a woman's right to choose?
I have a slight feeling that there are like 3 instant cases that are somehow woven in this thing, which I'm not going to comment on. I'll simply say there's a lot of case law on this subject, and our view of the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause is not the French view, which is a total separation, but it is designed to allow people of 50 or 60 different religions to live together in one country. And I read 2 interesting books on that. One, which I recommend to you, Archie Cox told me to read it. It's called The Law and Its Compass. It's some lectures that were given by Lord Radcliffe at Northwestern many years ago. And he points out how the freedom of religion, those are the 2 clauses there, are absolutely basic for this reason, that in the 17th century, after the wars of religion, as they deeply closed, and you can imagine how people felt, because to hold the opposite religion meant to condemn the whole family, including the children, to hell forever. You see? They felt very strongly, but they made a decision. And the decision was, you practice your religion,
2025 address 5901 Weber, apartment 4342,
and teach it to my children,
for a second subject.
And that, he said, was basic. And the free speech and others grew out of that. So it's important. It's number 1 in the first one.
Yes.
From Piedmont, California, serve your home.
And they're both trying to be negative 29.
I want to get a basic question. How did you feel about the Senate not entertaining the nomination of Justice Garland for a Supreme Court position?
How I felt, I think I will say this, that I was not in the position of nominating anyone. I was nominated. I was not in the position of confirming anyone. I was confirmed. So to ask me about the process of nomination and confirmation is like asking for the recipe of chicken a la king from the point of view of the chicken.
Well,
no, I know. That was just a way. That was a way of avoiding answering the question.
Well, yeah, but hold on a second. I see where he's coming from. I mean, you may be chicken, but you're also an American citizen. And there is something to be said about the necessity of the Senate to advise and consent on nominations for the Supreme Court. And that is an excellent debate right now, whether we should wait until after the midterms, whether we should go ahead and confirm a new justice now. You've got to have a feeling on this as an American. You are a justice, yes, but you have to feel something about this. I mean, don't you? Or are you really that just emotionally removed from it?
Not everything that is thought has to be said. Not everything that is said. Who said that? Somebody at Yale. It was very good, actually. It's so true. Not everything that is thought has to be said. Not everything that is said has to be written. And not everything that is written has to be published. Which we're sorry about it.
Well,
right.
Yes.
Hi, my name's Ted.
A man was hit by a vehicle, and he was getting on a bus.
Unit
110, he was bleeding from the head.
Dissent, Justice
Causing
Breyer, it's my
disturbance on the bus with the female
you
that hit him.
and Justice Kagan wrote a separate dissent from Justice Sotomayor and Bader Ginsburg in the recent decision about the immigration ban. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about what motivated you to do that, and if that's standard to have multiple dissents written or not.
Sometimes yes, sometimes no. And that's such a sense. I don't normally do this, and that is special. I mean, normally what I'm about to say, but that's such a special case, and it's such a special time that the only thing I can do about that particular question you asked, which I've been unfair to all your questions, but for the same reason, because I think I just better be safe rather than sorry. So I can recommend you to read the two, and you will see if you read the two where they are similar and where they are different.
Yes. I'm Sam Gregorio from Shreveport, Louisiana. There's discussion today that Roe v. Wade may be overruled because that decision does not fit the text and language of the Constitution or the original intent of the Constitution. Assuming that to be true for this question, if Roe v. Wade is reversed, doesn't that call into question the Supreme Court decisions stating that a corporation is a person and that a corporation has religious rights? Because those two issues are not found in the text or language of the Constitution or in the original intent of the Constitution.
Yeah, because you want, this is the problem that I've managed so far to stay away from it. And I think I still stay away from it. And if you want, and very interesting, if you're really interested in some of the things which you put in a minor part of this, but a very interesting book I read recently, if I can have a commercial, is I read a book by a professor at UCLA, whom I know, called Adam Winkler, on the history of corporations being a person. And if you get interested in that subject, which I'm not sure you are, but if you are, read it. It's a good book. Yes. I know it's not satisfactory if I don't answer things like that, but I just feel it.
Hi, I'm Courtney Stewart Alban. I'm a lawyer and I live in Los Angeles. I appreciated your point that the Supreme Court doesn't think generally, or just doesn't think generally, but don't deal in generalities. I'm wondering though if you can then speak to how, in ways in which you feel you specifically have changed in your tenure on the bench, or in the ways in which you're approaching the law, or in deliberating with your colleagues. Has that changed over the course of time?
I think that probably, I'll say with Nino, the greatest difference, I think, between us, which we would discuss a lot, and we did that. We had a great event, I thought, down in Lubbock, Texas, in the football field, where they had about, I think, a couple of thousand undergraduates. And I said the real, I mean, he agrees. Every judge, my best every judge, when he approaches a problem of text, will read the text. And it always makes a difference. It limits what you can't say, at the least. The history of it. They'll look at tradition. They'll look at precedent. They will look at the purpose of this. Somebody had some reason for writing this. And in the Constitution, there's some value that underlies this. And a particular value of the First Amendment is not the same as the Fourth Amendment. And they'll look at consequences. So the language, the history, the tradition, the precedent, the purposes or values, and the consequences. All judges look at those, and some emphasize more the first four. You know, the precedent, and the language, and the history, and tradition, and some, probably naturally, will emphasize more the purposes and the consequences. It's a slight oversimplification. So he says to me, and in the constitutional area,
going to be a disturbance with a female named Irene and a Hispanic male in a white shirt. Disturbance over rent money. They're requesting a CPW on the male subject.
And look more at what I think is the underlying value, which changes, not the value, but how it's applied changes over time. So if I ask him a slight wise question, of the internet, then he replies and says, actually, I knew that. That's why I was saying. And then he would say, I'd say, well, what about, if you do everything the way they did it in 1789, no one would want to live under that Constitution. And he said, yes. He says, that's probably right, but I'm not saying do everything. I'm saying lean more in that direction. And I'll tell you this, the way you do it, which you get a rough idea from the first thing, this is the way you do it. It's so complicated. He says it's like this. The two campers, one's putting on his running shoes, and the other says, where are you going? He says, there's a bear coming to the camp. He says, but you can't outrun a bear. He says, yes, but I can outrun you.
A conversation with Supreme Court Justice Stephen Breyer recorded at the Aspen Institute in Colorado.
You see, I think his will be too rigid. He thinks that the approach that I tend to take, leave it too open to the judges to substitute what they think is good in general for law. And of course, I don't think I'm doing that. Now, I would say over time, probably because I probably pay more attention to it. I don't give up.
They would like a callback reference.
I want to be sure I have not gone too far with this
Let me know when you're ready for the phone number.
If the language says something about a carrot, that is not an iceberg, I mean, just things you can't do. And so, to some degree. Did you make, Sandra said this, when you first get there, those first 2 or 3 years,
for cancel animal control, and you actually have a message call as well.
You will
Let me know if you're ready to copy that, or if you want to come back.
And you will make footprints.
Send it to Mike.
And you will discover in later years that those footprints tend to guide you. Because suppose they didn't. Then you just decide anything you want. That would be terrible. Because then the public, the American people, would have lost control. Reason through the complex sets of things I listed at the outset. But reason and consistency is the key, I think, to virtue in judging. And anyway, I'd be repeating myself.
Let's see if we can get to one or two more really quick questions before we have to go. Yes, briefly.
Justice, you were asked a question about a candidate. I'm going to ask you about an unrelated candidate. So before you became a Supreme Court Justice, you worked for Senator Kennedy. What was the thing that you learned working for Senator Kennedy which has most guided you in your practice on the court?
There were like 6 things, and my law clerks one year had them engraved on an enamel cup that sits up there. The first one was... What was it? What are you talking about? Something like that. But the one that I learned most, that I do think, and not everybody does, but the one I learned most from him was, I would say, well, 2 things. One, he'd tell Ken Feinberg and me, we're like his assistants over there in judiciary, he'd say, work it out. And we'd say, well, how? That's your problem. You go work it out. Okay? That's what he was like. And he had a sense of humor, but he was serious. Now, what I learned the most? Don't go for the credit. That's what he would say. And of course, being a senator, he has to get elected, he has to get some credit. But don't go for the credit. Credit is a weapon. You use it. And you use that weapon in order to get something done. And if you have a choice between being the hero of the hour with lots of credit, or getting something done, and it's only 20% of what you want, go for the 20%. The best is the enemy of the good. Over and over. And I cannot tell you how many times I saw him put that into practice. We'd be trying to get something. There'd be a senator, maybe from the other party, and he'd be talking, what a good idea you have. Because eventually you'd say something, even with the other party, etc., that we agree with. What a good idea. Let's work with that. And we work with that and try and get something done. And if it gets done, who is it he pushes out in front of the press conference? You. What a help you were. You see? What a help you were. And the object is to get the thing done. The object is not really to get the thing. And working with him on God, it was a pleasure. And he had a sense of humor, as I said. It was just fun. And it was also, I learned a great deal. And a great deal working with them.
I know we have to adjourn just a second. The elements are not on our side, so I want to get one last question in before we have to let you go. And it, of course, as we're thinking about the transition of the court, we'll have a new Supreme Court justice in due course. I wonder how you are contemplating your future on the court, whether or not you have thought about how you're contemplating your own future as an associate justice. Is there a point at which you will start to get ready to step down?
Yes, there is such a point.
And how, pray tell, are you thinking about what that point might look like?
No.
Oh, come on. No. No. See, here's...
For Robert Lee McKinney, I'm showing it to have a not-eligible IPD expires 2019.
I think it's easy for you to say
12,
no.
13, 17.
But there are a lot of Americans right now who are deeply, deeply concerned about the direction of the country. And the Supreme Court is something we have no power over. We can't touch that. And so I think it means a lot to people who look to you as an exemplar of the law to know that you are there, or to know that you are leaving, to give them confidence in what's going on with the court. We don't have any power over the Supreme Court. So, for those Americans who look at the court as this vast, main, untouchable structure, and you within it, and wondering, well, what's that like? Who is he in there? What would you say to them about your future on the court?
I'd say that I'll do my job as long as I think I can do it properly.
I'm getting conflicting. They found a warrant under Nicholas Garcia.
And
it's 1027 of 89, but one of the officers pulled up his photo in IDs, I think.
I said, well, you say, how will I know when I go on it?
He's got a different first name.
That's what you really want to know.
The one that we have a 29 for is going to be Nicholas Garcia, date of birth of 10/27/1989. He also uses 10/24 in 1989. He has several aliases. So he was under Nicholas Garcia, but he also goes by Nicholas B. He also goes by Nicholas.
About that. It was field, they saw.
He has
the same point for Holmes and Abel Brown. So you remember the day when you went off and saw Justice, whatever it was, and told him that he stepped down and done a great job. And Holmes said, yeah. He said, I do remember a dirtier day's work.
We have found two of them in Nicholas Garcia, but we did not see that. Well, we saw the Ronnie one, but we didn't know if that was going to be his or not.
And so it will become
one of the patrol units just pulled up his picture.
as it does for people as they get older, this seems to be about the right time. And there we are. And that's the most I can say.
Well, we're grateful to have had you for this time. Thanks for talking to us. Ladies and gentlemen, Justice Stephen Breyer. Thank you, sir. Appreciate it.
WAMU radio host Joshua Johnson in a conversation with Supreme Court Justice Stephen Breyer, recorded at the Aspen Institute in Colorado. On C-SPAN Radio, WCSP-FM, Washington. Up next, Washington Today.
On this episode of C-SPAN's The Weekly Podcast, our guest is former White House Press Secretary Mike McCurry. He joins us to talk about the current state of affairs between the Trump administration and the White House press corps. He reflects on his time behind the podium, how he dealt with reporters during the Clinton administration, and offers his assessment of the current press secretary, Sarah Sanders.
When you have a president that declares the press the enemy of the people, and that some portion of the American public, maybe 75%, adhere to that belief, then we are losing something that is fundamentally important in the way our founders constructed this government in our republic, in our Constitution. I mean, the freedom of the press is protected in the First Amendment for a very specific reason, because they knew that there would have to be accountability for those who are and that they would need to have some vigorous, critical dialogue in order to keep people who have power in check. I'm not sure this president and the current press secretary has any appreciation of that very, very important constitutional constitutional concern.
C-SPAN's podcast, The Weekly. It's now available on Spotify as well as the free C-SPAN radio app or wherever you listen to your favorite podcast.
The Authorization Act is the most significant investment in our military and our warfighters in modern history, and I am very proud to be a big part of it. It was not very hard. You know, I went to Congress, I said, let's do it, we got to do it. We're going to strengthen our military like never, ever before, and that's what we did.
President Donald Trump wrapping up his New Jersey vacation by visiting neighboring New York at Fort Drum today, signing the 2019 Defense Authorization Bill. Good afternoon and welcome to Washington Today for Monday, August 13th, 2018. I'm Bill Scanlon. More from that event today in just a moment, but first a quick look at headlines. President Trump is questioning whether Special Counsel Robert Mueller's investigation into Russian election interference during the presidential campaign will be dropped. Now that the FBI has fired one of Mr. Mueller's former investigators. Former agent Peter Strzok's lawyer said today that he had been fired from the agency over texts that were critical of candidate Donald Trump. Mr. Mueller removed Peter Strzok from his team immediately last year once the texts were discovered. House Freedom Caucus Chair Representative Mark Meadows of North Carolina said in a statement, quote, Peter Strzok was fired from the FBI because of what his own written words plainly showed. He was willing to use his official FBI position to try and stop President Trump from getting elected, end quote. In tweets today, President Trump lashed out at former White House advisor Omarosa Manigault Newman, saying she has been, quote, fired for the last time. Ms. Manigault Newman, who has authored a book, Unhinged, has released audio recordings she made, including one of her firing by Chief of Staff John Kelly in the Situation Room. The president tweeted that John Kelly said she was a, quote, loser and, quote, nothing but problems. Overseas, Turkish President Erdogan says his country is, quote, faced with an economic siege. Turkey's central bank took action today to free up cash for banks as the country grapples with a currency crisis sparked by concerns over President Erdogan's economic policies and a trade and diplomatic dispute with the United States, including tariffs announced last week by President Trump. The president today ventured, as we mentioned, to Fort Drum in upstate New York. He was there to sign the Defense Programs Bill, the 2019 John McCain Defense Authorization Bill, named after the ailing Armed Services Chair who's been back home in Arizona battling cancer this year. The president was also there to boost the campaigns of New York Representatives Claudia Tenney and Elise Stefanik, and gave a shout-out to Arizona Republican Senate candidate, Representative Martha McSally, who's running for Jeff Flake's seat. Here's Congresswoman Stefanik.
Mr. President, it is truly an honor to welcome you to Fort Drum, home of the historic 10th Mountain Division, the most deployed unit in the U.S. Army since 9/11. Thank you for being here to sign the historic National Defense Authorization Act, which includes the largest pay increase, support for our military families, and investing in our military readiness. Climb to glory, 10th Mountain Division. Thank you.
She's an incredible representative. I also want to thank Representatives Don Baker, Dan Donovan, and Joe Wilson, who are with us today also. Thank you. Where are you? Stand up, please. Hi, Dan. Stand up. Thank you. Thank you, fellas. Very much. There's another member of Congress here today who is not only an Air Force veteran, but the first woman ever to fly a fighter jet in combat in U.S. history. And I've gotten to know her very well, and she is terrific. Congresswoman Martha McSally. Congresswoman. Thank you, Martha. Thank you for being here. Numbness and tingling to the left side of the face. Work off EMS 11607.
Thank you very much. The President today signing the bill that sets Pentagon programs and policy for the next fiscal year. CQ writes about that, saying only twice in the last 33 years has the measure been enacted prior to October 1st, the start of the fiscal year. The most recent time that happened was more than 2 decades ago in fiscal 97. The last time the act was enacted before September was way back in fiscal 1978, according to CQ. Here's the President and what's in that measure.
Last year, we secured a historic $700 billion to rebuild our military, and now
The National Defense Authorization Act paves the way for another 1,700. Listen to this. So, we've been trying to get money. They never gave us money for the military for years and years, and it was depleted. We got $700 billion, and next year, already approved, we have $716 billion to give you the finest planes and ships and tanks and missiles. Anywhere on Earth, nobody makes them like we do. And very, very far distant in this case. Jobs are very important in all cases. But in this case, military might is more important than even jobs. But all of this equipment is made right here in the USA, and it's the best equipment on Earth. Nobody makes it like we do. So you have $700 billion and now $716 billion. So congratulations. America is a peaceful nation, but if conflict is forced upon us, we will fight and we will win. Right, General? Right? Right? Gotta believe it, Generals. They're the guys. We're powered by the unstoppable force of the United States Army, very special. With this new authorization, we will increase the size and strength of our military by adding thousands of new recruits to active duty, reserve and National Guard units, including 4,000 new active duty soldiers. And we will replace aging tanks, aging planes and ships with the most advanced and lethal technology ever developed, and hopefully we'll be so strong we'll never have to use it. But if we ever did, nobody has a chance.
President today speaking at Fort Drum, New York, the home of the 10th Mountain Division. He also took the opportunity to boast about economic growth in the U.S., and he also dished out some of his regular criticism of the news media.
You need some vehicle information?
We have the greatest economy we've ever had.
Yeah, the vehicle is supposedly registered.
I think that's going to help us a lot in a lot of ways.
Did you run on regular with the date of birth out of Florida?
And doing all of the things
both place. The vehicle is registered to Kenneth Scott Davis, Bituin, and Corpus.
A number that the media
okay. Is there any ID history on the address in Corpus that comes back to?
It's during the campaign. 1201. I'm so proud of myself. I didn't call them the fake news media. I didn't call them. I said to myself, I will not today in front of our great armed forces call them fake news. We know the real truth, but we won't say it today. But they wouldn't have believed it possible. 4 million new jobs. Nobody would have thought that possible on the campaign trail. If when we were campaigning, Mike, if I would have said that, if I would have said 2 million new jobs, people would have laughed us off the stage. Well, we have 4 million new jobs.
Former White House Press Secretary Sean Spicer is out with a new book on his time behind the White House podium. The Briefing, Politics, Press, and the President. In today's Washington Journal, we asked about his time working with Omarosa Manigault Newman and revelations in her new book.
Mr. Spicer, if I may, a couple of questions about your former colleague Omarosa Manigault, particularly what she said specifically to you. This about a non-disclosure agreement and basically essentially saying these are nice, this gives you some type of money to say nice things about the president. First of all, what's your response to that?
It is completely false. Here's the deal. Let's just walk through the timeline. I left the White House September 1st of last year. I signed a book deal in December of that year. I submitted the book in May of that year. I joined America First, a super PAC that supports the president's policies, on June 15th. So I hadn't received a penny from anyone in the Trump apparatus or anyone connected to Trump until June 15th of this year, after my book had been submitted. I did not sign a non-disclosure agreement. America First has put out a statement saying exactly that I didn't join them until the 15th and that I didn't sign a non-disclosure agreement. So look, you have to consider the source. She is out there trying to make money. she's trying to hawk a book. And the contradictions of, the interesting thing is I just talked about my own timeline. Let's look at her timeline. She left the White House at the beginning of the year, where when she left office, she continuously praised the president, and then within weeks was shopping a book to publishers, claiming quite the opposite, because it was pretty clear that they were telling her that in order to sell, in order to get an advance, she would have to say something nasty. Look, my book, which has been out there, I think is very candid, talking about my experience, what I would do to the last caller, Devin, talking about what I would do better, how I could have, you know, had some of those instances. I don't think if you read that book that you can say that I wasn't extremely candid in some of my shortcomings. Her book is completely different. It's an attempt to go after the President of the United States because she got fired. She even lies about that. When she left, she said she resigned. Now she's saying she was fired. She brought a personal recording device into the Situation Room of the White House to record the Chief of Staff of the White House in violation of countless security protocols, in violation of her own security clearance. I mean, look, you just have to look at the source, and I think that there's no question that she has a huge credibility issue.
All of that conversation with Sean Spicer and all of today's Washington Journal available at cspan.org. Some news about another former Trump official. This afternoon, the Associated Press reporting that the prosecution has rested its case in the fraud trial of former Trump campaign manager Paul Manafort. The oversight arm of the federal government, the Government Accountability Office, today announced it would be using Twitter daily to release data on federal spending and policies. The agency's head, Comptroller General Gene Dodaro, spoke today at the American Institute of Certified Public Accountants meeting. He talked about trends and challenges in government accountability. He was also asked about the federal budget process and the fiscal health of the government.
First question talks about your nation's fiscal health report and whether you've, I guess your opinion, or you've had any indications how seriously Congress is reading and considering that report.
Yes, there's been a resolution introduced in Congress that would require the Comptroller General to address a joint session of Congress every year on the fiscal health of the federal government. Now, it hasn't passed yet, but it's got a lot of co-sponsors. So I think that compared with years ago, I would say that more members of Congress are aware of the fiscal condition, but they need to continue to stay engaged and deal with it. So there's more of a consensus now, and I think that there is an issue. There's less of a consensus on what to do about it, and that needs to be developed, and it needs to be a bipartisan effort. Also, you know, with the next Congress, there'll be a lot of new members coming in. There's at least 60 members of Congress that have announced they're not running, so it'll be a big turnover. So I plan a major outreach effort to deal with the new members next year as well.
Okay, the next one, it says, your comments suggest the need for an agile federal government to respond to risk. How is the federal government changing to respond to the high need to become more agile while maintaining accountability?
Very slowly. That's a very astute observation on what I'm saying. The federal government needs to be more nimble in these areas. I think that some of the president's management agenda areas right now are very important to focus on. I mean, one of the ways is through technology and reshaping the workforce. A lot of agencies are going to have a high degree of requirements over the next coming years, and while you're losing a lot of institutional knowledge, you also have the opportunity to reshape the workforce going forward. The federal government's finally, belatedly implementing enterprise risk management. There's so many non-areas of risk that they're not dealing with. 6 of our high-risk areas have been on the high-risk list since 1990. And the risks are still there, and they've evolved, and in some cases gotten more serious.
Medic 2 for difficulty breathing, 4201 Violet Road, 4201 Violet Road at Stonewall Mobile Home Park, cross street of Mayfield. Going to be Unit 16 for a 61-year-old subject with difficulty breathing and pain to the left side. Work off EMS 11670.
down from its April estimate of 3.3%. The updated estimate projects that 4.1% second quarter spike of real GDP will come back down in the third and fourth quarters. CBO saying, quote, such moderation occurs because several factors that boosted second quarter growth, including a rebound in the growth of consumer spending from a weak first quarter and a surge in agricultural exports, are expected to either fade or reverse. While President Trump is set to return to the White House this evening, his Medicare-Medicaid chief, Seema Verma, today hosted a White House conference. The Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services last week announced an effort that would curtail accountable care organizations. The Washington Post writes that the ACOs can be teams of doctors, hospitals, or other providers who become responsible for all the health care needs of a specific group of patients. Under the ACA, they write, these teams have choices about their financial arrangements with the government. They can either collect bonuses if they provide better care at lower cost than the regular Medicare program, or they can collect greater amounts if they're also willing to accept the risk of owing money in case they end up overspending. At today's White House event, Administrator Verma emphasized technological efforts to improve claims benefit data access for Medicare beneficiaries.
Today's conference is about Blue Button 2.0, where we've put all of the patient and claims data for the regular traditional fee-for-service program. We put that in an API format, and that's what we're going to spend a lot of time talking about today. But we're not stopping there. We are leading by example, and we're going to be calling on all insurers to do the same and release this data in an API format. And you'll see through our regulatory process that we're very serious about that. We're also going to talk to our hospitals about when patients leave the hospital, what type of discharge data should be made available to the patient and to the other providers. And we've also asked the question for those providers that are participating in the Medicare program, should having interoperability and providing patients their data, should that be a requirement to participate in the Medicare program? So we've asked that question. We're bringing in a lot of that information, and you'll see more from us on that. So we're committed on this issue to make sure that data becomes available. We're also working in collaboration with the Office of the National Coordinator. We expect to see regulations from them on trusted exchange. And we know that there's a lot of work that we still need to do. We need to address the issue of patient identification, the issue of standards, and while there's been a lot of great work done by FHIR and others, that's something that we're going to need to continue to work on. We are very excited that all of you are here today. Since we launched Blue Button, I think our number is around 600 developers that are starting to look at our data. I think that when we think about the data that's available, we're already thinking about it in terms of, well, patients are going to want this data so that they can understand their health. And we know that providers are going to want this data so that they can be able to understand their patient profile. And we're excited about the advances in artificial intelligence that's going to be able to take all of this data and make it meaningful. But I think today's conversation is also about where do we go from here? We know the basics, but I think that the potential of what this data could mean for our country, for healthcare, is really unimaginable.
Also in the nation's capital today, Colorado Governor John Hickenlooper was at that CPA conference we played a moment ago. Governor Hickenlooper, who's mentioned as a possible 2020 Democratic presidential candidate, was also asked about the impact of marijuana legalization in the Rocky Mountain State.
I have a question. I want to preface my question by saying I grew up in Littleton, and I have 5 siblings with kids and grandkids in Denver. Wow. How has the legalization of recreational weed affected the business environment and the quality of the workforce in the Denver metro area?
You know, usually it's the first question.
That's why I started.
You know, you do one of these jobs, and no matter what you think you're going to run on, the world, fate, delivers other choices for you. And I appreciate that question because it is what I get asked so frequently. I oppose the legalization of recreational marijuana, but our state passed it 55-45. And I took an oath, and when we passed it, we put it in the Constitution. I took an oath to uphold that Constitution. So I view it as perhaps one of the great social experiments of this century. and we were going after it as aggressively as we can to see if we can make it work. And I will tell you, we had seen no problem with the business climate. In the same way that most people don't ever have to worry about people coming into work drunk, people haven't come into work high. And our Supreme Court has reaffirmed the right of any company to do, through urinalysis or any test, if someone's got THC in their system at any level, they can be fired. And that is every business's right. It's rarely happened. The big things we were worried about, a spike in consumption, didn't happen. A spike in teenage consumption, we were worried that the kids would think since we legalized it, we adults legalized it, that it was okay. And we know it for kids it's not. Just so you're all clear when you talk to your kids, there are still strong studies that suggest the high THC marijuana today, when your brain's growing rapidly, up until you're probably 23 or 24, that this high THC marijuana can take a sliver of your long-term memory permanently. Right? And that's a serious thing that kids don't think about. And we spend, when I think about taxing it, it's about a $1.5 billion industry in Colorado now. We tax the living daylights out of it. We actually lower the taxes because we want to make sure we get rid of the black market. But we now spend millions of dollars telling kids they shouldn't take it. And we've actually, since legalizing it, seen the beginning of a decline in teenage consumption. So that we made mistakes, we figured this out. I mean, that's something I could probably spend an hour talking about the legalization of marijuana. But I am just at the point now where I'm saying, after the vote, if I'd had a magic wand, could have waved that wand and reversed the vote, I would have done it. Now, I look at the old system where we sent millions of kids to prison, most of them Latinos and African Americans and kids of color. I think now, I have that magic wand, I put it in the drawer. And I'll wait a few more years and see whether we can create a new system that, while not perfect, is better than the old system, and that we look at the reality and start testing and get the facts. You know, it's a class 1 narcotic, so no one's ever been able to accurately, you know, on long-term vertical clinical trials, tested what it does, what the real consequences of marijuana, because it's a Schedule 1 narcotic. So hopefully we get the federal government to allow us to bank it, to get it off that Class 1 narcotics list so that we can actually do tests on it. I'll tell you, I'll finish with the one thing that you have seen in terms of increase in consumption, the one demographic are senior citizens. And I lay that out just as, I don't know whether it's the baby boomers coming home to roost, revisiting the happy days of their college life, or maybe it's aches and pains and the joints and arthritis and getting older. But that is the one demographic.
That is Colorado Governor John Hickenlooper earlier today. Well, while the August recess continues for the U.S. House until September 4th, the Senate returns this Wednesday. Federal spending and judicial nominations expected to occupy their agenda over the next few weeks. Off the floor, the Senate Judiciary Committee members are prepping for the upcoming confirmation hearings for Supreme Court nominee Judge Brett Kavanaugh. He spoke today with CQ Roll Call legal affairs writer Todd Ruger and asked about the overall timetable for the hearings and Senate floor vote.
Well, they are the Senate Republicans, led by Judiciary Committee Chairman Chuck Grassley of Iowa, is set September 4th week for confirmation hearings. So that's a Tuesday after Labor Day. And they're going to be opening statements one day, questioning the next. Some outside groups will do some testimony after that. And so it'll last 3 or 4 days. And then they've got about 2 weeks where they're going to be on the agenda for the Senate Judiciary Committee, and then it's ready for a floor vote. And Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell of Kentucky would be thinking that he would be trying to put it on the floor immediately. And he has said that he wants to beat October 1st, which is the first day of the Supreme Court's upcoming term.
Of course, both sides are preparing for those hearings. There seems to be, though, a difference of opinion on reviewing documents. Chairman Grassley saying, quote, it's plenty of time, but you report that Chuck Schumer, the Democratic leader, and other advocacy groups are saying Republicans are, quote, rushing the confirmation process. How does the Kavanaugh time frame compare with recent Supreme Court nominees' experience?
Well, when you compare it to other nominees, it's about the same time frame or maybe a little bit longer to go from nomination to confirmation hearing. But Judge Kavanaugh has been on the appeals court here in Washington, the D.C. Circuit, for 12 years, so he's got a lot of opinions to go through. He's been part of the Washington fixture political scene for more years than that, so he's made a lot of speeches and been on a lot of panels and stuff. There's all that to go through. Plus, he worked in the George W. Bush White House, first in the White House counsel's office and then as staff secretary. And so there are hundreds of thousands of documents related to that. So he's got more documents in his past than other nominees, and they're right now coming out on a rolling process as they're reviewed to be released publicly. And it's taking quite some time. There's just some that were released over the weekend, and the Democrats are saying, first of all, this isn't all of the documents, but second of all, there's so many to review that they're just trying to rush through the process.
That group that was released over the weekend, or as the weekend began, some 90,000, we understand. What time frame does that come from in Judge Kavanaugh's employment history?
So that comes from the request that Judge Grassley gave to the National Archives to get records about his time as White House counsel. So this is about 2001 and 2002, and there's a lot of stuff in there about the issues he was working on at that time, which was judicial nominations, as well as just some questions about what employees of the White House could do politically or what they couldn't, and who would be reimbursed. So a lot of just legal questions, and there's not a lot of juicy legal opinions or anything in there that the Democrats might be looking for to question him at the confirmation hearing.
From the archives, though, we understand that the archivist of the U.S., David Ferriero, today has turned down Senator Dianne Feinstein's request for archived documents, saying, quote, that that wouldn't be part of the normal procedure. What were Democrats hoping to find out in those archived documents that now, I guess, won't be released to Democrats anyway?
Right. Well, so as I just said, Chuck Grassley had asked for the records for Kavanaugh's time as a White House counsel, and the Democrats wanted the records from his time as a staff secretary, and Grassley thought that was too broad of a request, that it would bring the number of documents way up, hundreds of thousands. And so Grassley sent in a request just for the limited number of records. And Democrats then sent in their own request asking for the documents from when he was a staff secretary. And that the National Archives said, we only, per tradition, we only acknowledge the requests from the chairman of the committee, which is Grassley. And so the National Archives turned down this request from the Democrats.
14 coming code 1 to Memorial with an 83-year-old female. She's complaining is a worsening of patient Alzheimer's and dementia. A no time 4. Blood pressure 172, 75, heart rate 67, respirations at 16, saturations are at 96%, blood glucose is 94. Be at your facility in about 5 minutes.
A little delay when it comes to a vote on the nominee. Then once it gets to the floor, there's no longer a filibuster for Supreme Court nominees, so it just takes a simple majority to move on a procedural level to get to a final confirmation vote, and then just a majority to do a confirmation. So there's little procedurally that few procedural options they have.
And as you mentioned earlier and write about it, CQ.com, that the Majority Leader Mitch McConnell telling a radio station on Friday he's hopeful. I think he's going to be confirmed hopefully before the first Monday in October. That first Monday is actually October 1st, so it does tighten that time frame a bit, doesn't it?
It certainly does, and if Kavanaugh is confirmed, and if he is after some of the cases are argued, then those cases likely would be set for re-argument. So it wouldn't be a total wash, or it's not like he couldn't possibly participate in those cases. So, I think the Republicans just want to have Kavanaugh on the bench as soon as possible before the midterms, before the craziness of what might happen in a lame duck Senate after the election, before the new Senate starts.
Todd Ruger is legal affairs staff writer at CQ Roll Call. You can read his reporting at CQ.com and follow this story and others on Twitter. He's at Todd Ruger. Thanks for being with us.
Sure.
On Wall Street today, at the close, Turkey's financial crisis continues to rattle investors. The Dow Jones Industrial Average falling 125.44 points to close at 25,187. CNBC says this is the fourth straight day of losses, the longest losing streak since June. The S&P declined 0.4% to close at 2,821 for the day. It is August 13th, Monday, August 13th. On this date in history, in 1981, in a ceremony at his California ranch, President Ronald Reagan signed a historic package of tax and budget reductions. And in 1989, searchers in Ethiopia found the wreckage of a plane which had disappeared almost a week prior, carrying Mickey Leland, Democrat of Texas, and 14 other people. There were no survivors. That'll do it for today's edition of Washington Today, Monday, August 13th, 2018. We're back live tomorrow morning at 7 a.m. Eastern, simulcasting C-SPAN's Washington Journal. Here's a preview.
C-SPAN's Washington Journal, live every day with news and policy issues that impact you. Coming up Tuesday morning, Bloomberg News campaign finance reporter Bill Allison on rules for members of Congress on stockholding and trading. Then, as part of our Campaign 2018 coverage, reporters talk about primaries in 4 states, including Connecticut with Daniela Altamari, Hartford Courant State House reporter, Minnesota with Brian Russo, Minnesota Public Radio political reporter, and Wisconsin with Craig Gilbert, Milwaukee Journal Sentinel and Washington Bureau Chief. Be sure to watch C-SPAN's Washington Journal, live at 7 a.m. Eastern, Tuesday morning. Join the discussion.
C-SPAN Radio is WCSP-FM Washington, nationwide, streamed online at cspan.org, available on the C-SPAN Radio app, and also Washington Today, available as a podcast. And next up, here on C-SPAN Radio, part of today's Washington Journal.
Our next guest served as this administration's first press secretary, Sean Spicer, joining us. He's also the author of The Briefing, Politics, the Press, and the President. Mr. Spicer, good morning.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
Mr. Spicer, what's the perception of a White House press secretary, and what's the reality?
Well, that's a great question, because I think this administration has definitely taken things to a different level in terms of the intensity and scrutiny that position receives. But traditionally, I mean, I think a press secretary's job is to convey the information to the media and to the public when the president is unable to do so for themselves. I think the perception sometimes is you know, the press secretary, from a lot of what I've heard, is that people say, well, what do you think? And I think that the reality is the press secretary is not supposed to be speaking for themselves, but for the principle that they represent.
You write in the book, when it comes to President Trump's interest in your job and how he engaged with you in your job, you said this: he was always full of questions, wanting background of where a story comes from, and of course curious to know what we were going to say about it. He was never shy about giving us directions. He was extremely engaged, very particular, and insistent about how he wanted the points delivered. The more time I spent with him, the more I came to understand that President Trump wanted me to repeat his answers to the press verbatim. Could you expand on that?
Yeah, I mean, look, I've been doing this a long time, Pedro. Served a lot of different members of Congress, government officials, and candidates. And I think, generally speaking, the press team comes up with the lines that they think are most effective. President Trump is much more specific with how he wants his voice communicated. I think if you think about it, again, as I described the position, the job is to communicate the views and principles and ideas that the president, in this case, wants communicated. And the president recognizes that if that's going to be the case, then he wants to make sure that those words are conveyed exactly as he sees fit.
Walk a little bit then about the engagement on a day-to-day basis that you have with the president, especially developing what the statements and the comments from the White House would be.
So that's a great question. I talk about this in the book, that in order to get ready for the briefing or a major event, we would spend a good chunk of the morning going back and forth, trying to develop what the questions and appropriate responses would be. We bring in the subject matter experts, so maybe somebody from the National Security Council, maybe someone from the budget, depending on what the issue was. You'd bring in the relevant subject matter experts, and they would give you their take as to where the issue was, where they thought it was headed, and the appropriate response. Then I would go in and increasingly so started to check in with the president and said, these are the questions that I believe we're most likely to get. This is what your team recommends. And he would kind of give his take, and we'd go back and forth, sometimes with, what he wanted, and then we might have to check back in with some of the, as I mentioned, the subject matter experts to say, hey, the president really wants to convey it in this way. Do you think that's going to be an issue? Is that okay? And so, depending on the issue and the nature of it, where it stood, it might be one single interaction, or it might be a back and forth.
When the president makes statements about specific members of the press, CNN or other news organizations, did that shade how you approach the job? Who got questions, how you approach engagement with these news organizations?
Uncle was bleeding.
No,
I don't know where it's coming from.
He never asked me to specifically call anyone or not call anyone. That was something that I did myself, and I wrote about it extensively in the book, that I intentionally, I think, wanted to broaden the number of reporters that were called on in the briefing room and really try to expand and for what one reporter called democratize the press. That I believe that reporters from a variety of backgrounds, whether it was like foreign media, niche publications, local media,
Medic 3, Copper Engine 3, Medic 3, patient having a stroke, Morgan and Prescott,
different ethnic
Morgan and Prescott, 21-year-old female on a Clay Nissan Rogue,
who I called on in
arm and
the
left side of the
frequency of
face,
it, just so that there was a variety of voices being heard within the
Mr. Spicer, you and others, particularly you, though, have heard the president's comments about the press, enemy of the people, etc. What do you think about those statements? Is that appropriate for a president?
Well, I've said this very clearly, Pedro, that I think that a democracy, especially ours, is the sort of the beacon of democracies throughout the world, needs to have a free and robust press corps. I'm not a fan of calling out any industry with a broad brush. So, with respect to the media, I think it's more effective to call out inappropriate behavior or disrespectful behavior or a bad story. Or a lack of professionalism in a specific case, rather than paint an entire industry with a broad brush. Because when you do that, I don't think that you sort of throw out the good with the bad. And as I write in the book, there are a lot of good reporters that are in that briefing room. So I'm not one that believes or advocates that you should sort of use any industry and call it one particular thing. I know that as a conservative and as someone who voted for and supported President Trump, that I don't like it when people ascribe those kind of qualities to conservatives, and they say, well, all conservatives believe this, or people who support Donald Trump are the following. So I've not been a big believer in using sort of sweeping comments to paint any industry or group as being, synonymous with a particular trait.
So it was recently, you probably saw this as well in the Late Show with Stephen Colbert. It was the White House correspondent, Jim Acosta, talking about reporting of the president, particularly with him and other members of the White House. I want you to hear his perspective on his job and get your take on it.
Why do you think he dislikes CNN? Seems to like this more than any other news service. Is it because you guys investigated the dossier?
Well, there was an exclusive report that CNN had at that time on January 11th, and that was my mission in life, was to go into that press conference and ask a question about that story. But listen, ever since then, and this is what gets under their skin, we have had to be fact checkers in real time. We have had to try to tell the truth in real time. When the president says, Barack Obama wiretapped me, when he says Barack Obama wiretapped me at Trump Tower, not true. When he says that millions of people, undocumented people, voted in the election, that's why I lost the popular vote, that's not true. His political career was built, the foundation of his political career was built on a lie that Barack Obama was not born in this country. And so, listen, these are tough times. There's some tough questions to be asked, but I don't think we do ourselves any good, Stephen, if we shy away from these hard questions. And
Mr. Spicer, what do you think of that assessment?
Well, I think it's ironic that, you know, it's funny, Jim never actually talks about his own behavior. When was the last time that Jim actually broke a story? The reality is it's all about him and his antics, and this is the problem. He's turned the page from being a reporter to being an activist and a detractor of the president. It's not about actually reporting with him. He coached himself in this idea of First Amendment and a free press, which we all support. But look, his behavior has been unprofessional and disrespectful at best. You know, he posted this photo a couple weeks back of himself about 100 yards back from the president and made it seem as though the president ignored a question that he had asked when his own fellow reporters called him out and said there was no way the president could have possibly heard him because he was so far back behind tons and tons of, or hundreds of people in an audience. But to him, it's about the show. And I don't, I think the idea that he tries to make it about asking questions and facts is just ridiculous, because at the end of the day, with him specifically, it's not about the free press. It's not about tough questions. It's not about stories. It's about him creating a scene in the briefing room, him, jumping up and down, shouting stuff out, and making himself a story. And most reporters will tell you that it should never be about them. It's always about the story. And unfortunately, it's the inverse with him.
You say in your book, and I'm boiling this down a little bit, when it comes to White House coverage, there's 4 things that you're aware of: an unshakable focus on palace intrigue, a desire to break the story over real reporting, the desire to use cameras to become a cable star, and a partisan pack mentality.
Yeah. Well, I think all of those are true, and frankly, I go into detail in each one of them. But the reality is there is a pack mentality, and I talk about specific examples where reporters who dare to break out of that and ask questions that they think are important, either because they themselves find a topic interesting or because they represent a particular constituency, get sort of mocked and ridiculed by their colleagues if they don't go along with whatever the collective wisdom and thought is for the day. So, I mean, that is a big problem, and I think that you've seen this more and more where reporters have tried to make themselves the story and try to figure out how to get themselves on TV rather than focus on issues and the pursuit of a particular story. So I think there is a big problem with the behavior and the professionalism that's exhibited in that room.
Mr. Spicer joins us until close to 10 o'clock. If you want to ask him questions, again, the phone lines will be on the screen. Our first call for you, sir, comes from Minnesota. This is Derek on our independent line. You're on with Sean Spicer. Go ahead.
Towards Baldwin, occupied by a female 2 males, possibly not 286 in Indiana. Control 16044.
I just have a couple questions. I'd like a real definite definition of free press. Because from what I understand, the emperor has no clothes. The media has no clothes because they've been exposed the last 2 years for how much bias they are towards this president. I mean, I've never seen anything like it. And I think every study says that 90+% are Democrats or leftists or whatever. What is the actual free press? Because there's so much opinion, commentary, blah, blah, blah. I have a daughter who's going to one of the best journalism schools in the country, and I'd like your advice to her going into it, because I don't understand what the free press is anymore when it's all just based on conjecture, opinion, and...
Gotcha, Derek. We'll let our guest respond. Mr. Spicer, go ahead.
Well, Derek, I mean, I think Derek brings up some good points. And as I said in my earlier response, I don't like to make one big sweeping comment about all of them. There are a lot of good journalists that are in that briefing room. But I think by and large, the sort of Washington elite media that's represented by the networks and the cables and sort of the big conglomerate newspapers and wire services, tend not to understand or take the time to go outside the beltway and understand what's going on out there. So, look, I think a free press in my mind means that they can write whatever they want, and that we have a variety. We have liberal news, we have conservative news, we have business news. The ability to write and express yourself in this country is something that we cherish. But I think that, to your point, Derek, we need to recognize that so many of these folks in the establishment media have gone from being objective or trying to appear objective to going to being activists. And I think in expressing an opinion, whether it's on Twitter, whether it's on cable news outlets, they've stopped reporting and gone on to, literally opine behind them, about their beliefs, their ideas. And then, as you point out in your question, I think too often there's this degree of stories that are built completely on conjecture, where it's about what we think he is thinking or where we think, as opposed to actually reporting stuff. It's all about conjecture and subjective ideas about what they think might happen versus what the facts tell us.
From Minnesota, Republican line, Brad, hello.
Well, good morning there. I haven't spoken to you people for a while, but I look at life as, you know, that past behavior will tell you the near future. And years ago, it started in 1950. It was called Operation Mockingbird. And it was the CIA manipulating the people through the media. Well, it's kind of continuing even in another step, but it's the media with the FBI this time. But we've got a big problem with our media today, that they want to manipulate people.
Mr. Spicer, what do you think?
Well, look, I don't know that... Look, I write in the book, and Pedro, you just mentioned it a moment ago, that I try to sort of give people an idea of what was going on behind the scenes in terms of some of the stories and some of what actually happens, you know, beyond a story that you either read or see, what's happening in the lead up to that story and the back and forths and interaction that occurs. But I think that there is no question that a lot of folks in the media, as I mentioned to the last caller, have an agenda, have an opinion. But I don't think that that's all of it. I do think that there are a lot of good reporters that do a good job. I just think that more and more we're seeing a lot of these, what you would call establishment media types, really get involved in expressing themselves and taking an opinion.
When you say reporters who do a good job, name one, and why is that person doing a good job?
Jen Jacobs, Bloomberg. I think because you can disagree with us. And again, both Pedro and I mentioned a lot more than that. You know, Margaret Taleb, also of Bloomberg, who was the last White House Correspondents' Press Association's president, I think is a fair and balanced reporter. Steve Holland from Reuters. The reason is this: they can write tough stories, they can be tenacious, but they're professional and fair, meaning that they tell you, hey, this is what we have gathered, what's your side, you have a reasonable amount of time to respond to it. Too often, a lot of these reporters call and say, hey, we're on deadline, we're about to publish, what's your response to this major charge? It's always not something that can be responded to in 5 or 10 minutes. But too often, that's the mentality today. Hey, we have 8 anonymous sources that are saying the following, you have 5 minutes to respond. That's not professional, that's not fair, that's an attempt to engage in gotcha journalism. And I think that's where too often the stories are based now, is this attempt to get a clip or a click or be sensational and kind of follow the spirit of tabloid press versus straight journalism. So there are a lot of reporters that call and say, I'm working on this story, I'd like to hear your side of it, can you provide people that give us some background on it, but they truly come at the story from an objective place and try to gather the facts and try to understand what's happening, versus I think a lot of these people that figure out the narrative that they want to pursue, build a case, and then call you and tell you they're about to publish it.
You've seen it,
or in many cases don't even tell you that.
What you're thinking when it comes to news sources, do you equate mainstream media, and I'll just use the term there, with blogs such as Breitbart or the Daily Caller or CRTV? Do you equate those when it comes to news outlets in your thinking?
Well, I mentioned it earlier, but I think there's a spectrum. Sure, I read all of those, but I also will sometimes look at, left-leaning places like the Daily Beast or Huffington Post. So I think that you need to look at all of it and collectively try to gather as much as you can. But there's as much as there is on the right, there's definitely a lot on the left.
Who do you like on the, as you describe it, the left? Which is a main source for you?
Well, I mean, it's not a question of like. I think part of the job, if you're really trying to understand an issue, is to look at the full spectrum. So I might read a story from the Huffington Post or the Daily Beast, but when I do, I think there's a level of scrutiny that I'll put through and say, okay, now I actually want to find out further. Because I don't, generally speaking, when you read a story from one of those sources, it makes you wonder how much of it is an activism type journalism versus an attempt to really write it straight up, or something from BuzzFeed where, it's all the left-leaning sites, and you have to go, okay, now I need to kind of further investigate to find out, you know, whether this was them pursuing an agenda or how much of it is accurate.
From Minnesota, Democrats line, Tammy, good morning, you're next.
Good morning, C-SPAN. Thanks for taking my call. Question of the Spicer. Just wondering, which president, Obama or Trump, had the biggest inauguration?
That's a great question. You should read the book. It's fun. I think I've talked about that very extensively that first day and what my goal was to try to communicate, which was frankly, you know, to talk about the level of enthusiasm and interest there was in the inauguration.
Republican line, Georgia, this is Joy. Hi.
Hi there. I just wanted to discuss something about the different TV news people. I try to watch different news programs, especially MSNBC, CNN, and I try my best to watch them, but I hear it's nothing but hate, just pure hate. And I mean, I want to try to learn something from them, but the hatred that they spew about our president is just unbelievable. I've never learned as much about our country with the president as I have with President Trump. I have learned more in my lifetime, and I'm 74 years old. But I have to honestly turn it to someone, and I know when you say Fox News, you say but they don't spew the hatred like these other TV programs do. It's unbelievable. And I used to like MSNBC, like Joe in the morning, but I can't even stand to watch it anymore.
Thank you, Joy. Thank you very much, Mr. Spicer.
Well, look, I think, you know, we've talked about this during the segment, but I think there's each of these channels has now staked out, you know, where they stand on the political spectrum, and you're seeing it now. That you've got MSNBC and CNN that have staked out the left, Fox is staking out the right. You know, one of the reasons that I love C-SPAN is that you guys allow people to talk, you allow the viewers to make up their mind. So people can watch a government official take questions, give their response, or, you know, watch a hearing. And it allows people to see their government exactly what is said in an unfiltered way. I do think, as I mentioned before, you've now seen a lot of activism journalism, especially on the cable news channel, where there's a degree to which they understand that their audience and therefore their business model is predicated upon tailoring and focusing on a particular niche of the political spectrum.
Devin in Port Charlotte, Florida, Democrats line.
Hi, thank you for taking my call. Just a simple question. Any regrets, and what would you change if, you know, since in hindsight? And the other thing is, it's been documented that this current administration lies consistently every day. So I'd just like your response to that. Thank you.
So, Devin, on the first thing, I mean, I think the book, the reason I wrote the briefing is to give people an understanding of who I am, what I did, what was going on behind the scenes. And there are plenty of things that I've said that I would love to do over. Sometimes it's the tone that I use, sometimes it's the interaction that I had, sometimes it's the way I communicated. So there's no question. And I write about this specifically on several instances on how, you know, I would have liked to have been able to do it over. That's not how we get to live life, though. And part of what I explain in the book is that what I've tried to do is recognize whether it's a personal interaction or a professional, you know, issue or event, that the question that really comes down to it is, do you learn from those? Are you a better person or a better professional because of how you look back on the event and recognize how you could have done it better? So there are plenty of circumstances where I look back and say, wow, I could have answered that better, I could have interacted with that person better. I talk about those extensively in the book, I think in a very candid way, because I want people to understand that I'm not perfect. It was a tough job, it was intense. There are things that I wish I could do over again, and I want people to understand, not just, you know, not hear an excuse, but sometimes the context in which I made those decisions and why I did and what I would have, to your questions, done differently.
The book is called The Briefing, Politics, the Press, and the President, and Sean Spicer joining us, serving as the White House press secretary in the Trump administration. Mr. Spicer, if I may, a couple of questions about your former colleague, Omarosa Manigault, particularly what she said specifically to you. This about a non-disclosure agreement and basically essentially saying these are nice, this gives you some type of money to say nice things about the president. First of all, what's your response to that?
Shoreline 0.1.
It is completely false. Here's the deal. Let's just walk through the timeline. I left the White House September 1st of last year. I signed a book deal in December of that year. I submitted the book in May of that year. I joined America First, the super PAC that supports the president's policies, on June 15th. So I hadn't received a penny from anyone in the Trump apparatus or you know, anyone connected to Trump until June 15th of this year, after my book had been submitted. I did not sign a non-disclosure agreement. America First has put out a statement saying exactly that I didn't join them until the 15th, and that I didn't sign a non-disclosure agreement. So look, you have to consider the source. She is out there trying to make money. She's trying to hawk a book. And the contradictions of, the interesting thing is I just talked about my own timeline. Let's look at her timeline. She left the White House at the beginning of the year, where when she left office, she continuously praised the president. And then within weeks, was shopping a book to publishers, claiming quite the opposite, because it was pretty clear that they were telling her that in order to sell, in order to get an advance, she would have to say something nasty. Look, my book, which has been out there, I think is very candid, talking about my experience, what I would do to the last caller, Devin, talking about what I would do better, how I could have, you know, had some of those instances. I don't think if you read that book that you can say that I wasn't extremely candid in some of my shortcomings. Her book is completely different. It's an attempt to go after the President of the United States because she got fired. She even lies about that. When she left, she said she resigned. Now she's saying she was fired. She brought a personal recording device into the Situation Room of the White House to record the Chief of Staff of the White House in violation of countless security protocols, in violation of her own security clearance. I mean, look, you just have to look at the source, and I think that there's no question that she has a huge credibility issue.
This is Mary, Las Vegas, Nevada, independent line.
Hey, Sean, you're out there trying to hawk a book, too. As far as Omarosa goes, you know, I'll wait to hear the tape. I mean, the president does lie a lot, and so it's coming back at him. You know, and I don't know, there's so many horrible things going on. I mean, he stands up there and he calls the press enemy of the people, right out of the authoritarian playbook. I mean, you know, he goes after the NFL for taking a knee and sends a delegation of 7 to Russia on the 4th of July. Then he stands up there in Helsinki. I mean, Putin was just smiling. He looked like he just got through eating a red meat. So, I mean, if he deserves to be defended, he will be. But the truth does need to come out, and I think CNN and MSNBC are doing a damn good job. And Fox News is just going off the charts somewhere.
Gotcha, Mary. We'll let our guest respond.
Well, look, there's no question about it. I'm on here. I'm talking about the book. I am trying to promote it. But there's a difference. And I think if you read my book, you'll recognize that I talk about my life, my experiences. I think it's a very candid understanding of who I am as a person. But I don't go out there and act in a disloyal way as one of my former colleagues did. And I think the difference is, you know, Omarosa is selling a book trying to, you know, that goes after the President of the United States, who she praised publicly on the record, both in print and on video, within days of leaving the White House. I don't think there's anything inconsistent about my account and what I've said in that book, but I think there's a totally different style between how I'm approaching this and how she's approached it. So, you know, I think that the tone and the tenor are vastly different. The approach is different. I'm very proud of what I've written. I think you've seen, you know, by and large, the people who have read the book will tell you that it's a very candid approach to who I am as a person and the experiences of the last couple of years, and especially with respect to the campaign. If you're interested in understanding what was going on during that campaign, the data and the field operation that was used, part of the reason I wanted to write it was so that people could actually understand what was going on during the campaign. It's not just about the White House.
Did you have to get approval from the White House for the manuscript?
No.
And how is it that you didn't sign a non-disclosure agreement?
With America First?
No, with the White House.
Well, what Omarosa's charge was that when I left the White House, I, quote, took hush money and signed a non-disclosure agreement when I left. I did not. That's the charge that she made.
Former White House Press Secretary Sean Spicer, his new book titled The Briefing, Politics, the Press, and the President, on this morning's Washington Journal. Find the full discussion at cspan.org. WCSP-FM Washington. Up next, Washington Today.
The National Defense Authorization Act is the most significant investment in our military and our warfighters in modern history, and I am very proud to be a big part of it. It is not very hard. You know, I went to Congress, I said, let's do it, we got to do it. We're going to strengthen our military like never, ever before, and that's what we did.
President Donald Trump wrapping up his New Jersey vacation by visiting neighboring New York at Fort Drum today, signing the 2019 Defense Authorization Bill. Good afternoon and welcome to Washington Today for Monday, August 13th, 2018. I'm Bill Scanlon. More from that event today in just a moment, but first a quick look at headlines. President Trump is questioning whether Special Counsel Robert Mueller's investigation into Russian election interference during the presidential campaign will be dropped, now that the FBI has fired one of Mr. Mueller's former investigators. Former agent Peter Strzok's lawyer said today that he had been fired from the agency over texts that were critical of candidate Donald Trump. Mr. Mueller removed Peter Strzok from his team immediately last year once the texts were discovered. House Freedom Caucus Chair Representative Mark Meadows of North Carolina said in a statement, quote, Peter Strzok was fired from the FBI because of what his own written words plainly showed. He was willing to use his official FBI position to try and stop President Trump from getting elected, end quote. In tweets today, President Trump lashed out at former White House advisor Omarosa Manigault-Newman, saying she has been, quote, fired for the last time. Ms. Manigault-Newman, who has authored a book, Unhinged, has released audio recordings she made, including one of her firing by Chief of Staff John Kelly in the Situation Room. The president tweeted that John Kelly said she was a, quote, loser and, quote, nothing but problems. Overseas, Turkish President Erdogan says his country is, quote, faced with an economic siege. Turkey's central bank took action today to free up cash for banks as the country grapples with a currency crisis sparked by concerns over President Erdogan's economic policies and a trade and diplomatic dispute with the United States, including tariffs announced last week by President Trump. The president today ventured, as we mentioned, to Fort Drum in upstate New York. He was there to sign the Defense Programs Bill, the 2019 John McCain Defense Authorization Bill, named after the ailing Armed Services Chair who's been back home in Arizona battling cancer this year. The president was also there to boost the campaigns of New York Representatives Claudia Tenney and Elise Stefanik, and gave a shout-out to Arizona Republican Senate candidate, Representative Martha McSally, who's running for Jeff Flake's seat. Here's Congresswoman Stefanik.
Thank you, Mr. President. It is truly an honor to welcome you to Fort Drum, home of the historic 10th Mountain Division, the most deployed unit in the U.S. Army since 9/11. Thank you for being here to sign the historic National Defense Authorization Act, which includes the largest pay increase, support for our military families, and investing in our military readiness. Climb to glory, 10th Mountain Division. Thank you.
Outside registration today till 9 p.m. and up until 9 p.m.
She's an incredible representative. I also want to thank Representatives Don Baker, Dan Donovan, and Joe Wilson, who are with us today also. Thank you. Where are you? Stand up, please. Hi, Dan. Stand up. Thank you. Thank you, fellas. Very good. There's another member of Congress here today who is not only an Air Force veteran, but the first woman ever to fly a fighter jet in combat in U.S. history. And I've gotten to know her very well, and she is terrific. Congresswoman Martha McSally. Congresswoman. Thank you, Martha. Thank you for being here. Thank you.
President today signing the bill that sets Pentagon programs and policy for the next fiscal year. CQ writes about that, saying only twice in the last 33 years has the measure been enacted prior to October 1st, the start of the fiscal year. The most recent time that happened was more than 2 decades ago in fiscal 97. The last time the act was enacted before September was way back in fiscal 1978, according to CQ. Here's the president on what's in that measure.
Last year, we secured a historic $700 billion to rebuild our military, and now the National Defense Authorization Act paves the way for another 1,700. Listen to this now. So we've been trying to get money. They never gave us money for the military for years and years, and it was depleted. We got $700 billion, and next year, we have $716 billion to give you the finest planes and ships and tanks and missiles. Anywhere on Earth, nobody makes them like we do. And very, very far distant in this case. Jobs are very important in all cases. But in this case, the military might is more important than even jobs. But all of this equipment is made right here in the USA, and it's the best equipment on Earth. Nobody makes it like we do. So you have $700 billion and now $716 billion. So congratulations. America is a peaceful nation, but if conflict is forced upon us, we will fight and we will win. Right, General? Right? Right? Gonna believe it, generals. There they guys. They're powered by the unstoppable force of the United States Army. Very special. With this new authorization, we will increase the size and strength of our military by adding thousands of new recruits to active duty, reserve and national guard units, including 4,000 new active duty soldiers.
The vehicle's out here. He just flagged me down. GPS is still not come out here. Is there any way we can check and see what's going on with that?
Aging planes and ships with the most advanced and lethal technology ever developed, and hopefully we'll be so strong we'll never have to use it. But if we ever did, nobody has a chance.
President today speaking at Fort Drum, New York, the home of the 10th Mountain Division. He also took the opportunity to boast about economic growth in the U.S., and he also dished out some of his regular criticism of the news media.
We have the greatest economy we've ever had. I think that's going to help us a lot in a lot of ways. It also helps us a lot in funding and doing all of the things we're doing for our great military. We've created almost 4 million new jobs since the election, a number that the media in the back would never have said would be possible if during the campaign. I'm so proud of myself. I didn't call them the fake news media. I didn't call them. I said to myself, I will not today in front of our great armed forces call them fake news. We know the real truth, but we won't say it today. But they wouldn't have believed it possible. 4 million new jobs. Nobody would have thought that possible on the campaign trail. If when we were campaigning, Mike, if I would have said that, if I would have said 2 million new jobs, people would have laughed us off the stage. Well, we have 4 million new jobs.
Former White House Press Secretary Sean Spicer is out with a new book on his time behind the White House podium. The book, The Briefing, Politics, Press, and the President. On today's Washington Journal, we asked about his time working with Omarosa Manigault Newman and revelations in her new book.
Mr. Spicer, if I may, a couple of questions about your former colleague, Omarosa Manigault, particularly what she said specifically to you. This about a non-disclosure agreement and basically essentially saying these are nice, this gives you some type of money to say nice things about the president. First of all, what's your response to that?
It is completely false. Here's the deal. Let's just walk through the timeline. I left the White House September 1st of last year. I signed a book deal in December of that year. I submitted the book in May of that year.
They are in the area. They should be there shortly.
PAC that supports the president's policies on June 15th. Gang 65, so I haven't received a penny from anyone in the Trump apparatus or anyone connected to Trump until June 15th of this year, after my book had been submitted. I did not sign a non-disclosure agreement. America First has put out a statement saying exactly that I didn't join them until the 15th and that I didn't sign a non-disclosure agreement. So look, you have to consider the source. She is out there trying to make money. She's trying to hawk a book. And the contradictions of, the interesting thing is I just talked about my own timeline. Let's look at her timeline. She left the White House at the beginning of the year, where when she left office, she continuously praised the president, and then within weeks was shopping a book to publishers, claiming quite the opposite, because it was pretty clear that they were telling her that in order to sell, in order to get an advance, she would have to say something nasty. Look, my book, which has been out there, I think is very candid, talking about my experience, what I would do, to the last caller, Devin, talking about what I would do better, how I could have, had some of those instances. I don't think if you read that book that you can say that I wasn't extremely candid in some of my shortcomings. Her book is completely different. It's an attempt to go after the President of the United States because she got fired. She even lies about that. She said she resigned. Now she's saying she was fired. She brought a personal recording device into the Situation Room of the White House to record the Chief of Staff of the White House in violation of countless security protocols, in violation of her own security clearance. I mean, look, you just have to look at the source, and I think that there's no question that she has a huge credibility issue.
All of that conversation with Sean Spicer and all of today's Washington Journal available at cspan.org. Some news about another former Trump official this afternoon. The Associated Press reporting that the prosecution has rested its case in the fraud trial of former Trump campaign manager Paul Manafort. The oversight arm of the federal government, the Government Accountability Office, today announced it would be using Twitter daily to release data on federal spending and policies. The agency's head, Comptroller General Gene Dodaro, spoke today at the American Institute of Certified Public Accountants meeting. He talked about trends and challenges in government accountability. He was also asked about the federal budget process and the fiscal health of the government.
This question talks about your nation's fiscal health report and whether you've, I guess your opinion, or you've had any indications how seriously Congress is reading and considering that report.
Yes, there's been a resolution introduced in the House that would require the Comptroller General to address a joint session of Congress every year on the fiscal health of the federal government. It hasn't passed yet, but it's got a lot of co-sponsors. So I think that compared with years ago, I would say that more members of Congress are aware of the fiscal condition, but they need to continue to stay engaged and deal with it. So there's more of a consensus now, and I think that there is an issue. There's less of a consensus on what to do about it, and that needs to be developed, and needs to be a bipartisan effort. Also, with the next Congress, there'll be a lot of new members coming in. There's at least 60 members of Congress that have announced they're not running, so it'll be a big turnover. So I plan a major outreach effort to deal with the new members next year as well.
Okay, the next one says your comments suggest the need for an agile federal government to respond to risk. How is the federal government changing to respond to the high need to become more agile while maintaining accountability?
Very slowly.
That's
a very astute observation on what I'm saying. The federal government needs to be more nimble in these areas. I think that some of the president's management agenda areas right now are very important to focus on. I mean, one of the ways is through technology and reshaping the workforce. A lot of agencies are going to have a high degree of retirements over the next coming years, and while you're losing a lot of institutional knowledge, you also have an opportunity to reshape the workforce going forward. The federal government's finally, belatedly implemented enterprise risk management, but there are so many known areas of risk that they're not dealing with. 6 of our high-risk areas have been on the high-risk list since 1990, and the risks are still there, and they've evolved, and in some cases gotten more more serious.
That is Comptroller General Gene Dodaro. In a related story, the Congressional Budget Office today pulled back on its economic projections for the rest of the year. The Hill writes the U.S. economy will grow at 3.1% in 2018, according to updated projections by the CBO, down from its April estimate of 3.3%. The updated estimate projects that 4.1% second quarter spike of real GDP will come back down in the third and fourth quarters. CBO is saying, quote, such moderation occurs because several factors that boosted second quarter growth, including a rebound in the growth of consumer spending from a weak first quarter and a surge in agricultural exports, are expected to either fade or reverse. While President Trump is set to return to the White House this evening, his Medicare-Medicaid chief, Seema Verma, today hosted a White House conference. The Centers for Medicare-Medicaid Services last week announced an effort that would curtail accountable care organizations. The Washington Post writes that the ACO is going to be teams of doctors, hospitals, or other providers who become responsible for all the health care needs of a specific group of patients. Under the ACA, they write, these teams have choices about their financial arrangements with the government. They can either collect bonuses if they provide better care at lower costs than the regular Medicare program, or they can collect greater amounts if they're also willing to accept the risk of owing money in case they end up overspending. At today's White House event, Administrator Verma emphasized technological efforts to improve claims benefit data access for Medicare beneficiaries.
Today's conference is about Blue Button 2.0, where we've put all of the patient and claims data for the regular traditional fee-for-service program. We put that in an API format, and that's what we're going to spend a lot of time talking about today. But we're not stopping there. We are leading by example, and we're going to be calling on all insurers to do the same and release this data in an API format. And you'll see through our regulatory process that we're very serious about that. We're also going to talk to our hospitals about when patients leave the hospital, what type of discharge data should be made available to the patient and to the other providers. And we've also asked the question for those providers that are participating in the Medicare program, should having interoperability and providing patients their data, should that be a requirement to participate in the Medicare program? So we've asked that question. We're bringing in a lot of that information, and you'll see more from us on that. So we're committed on this issue to make sure that data becomes available. We're also working in collaboration with the Office of the National Coordinator. We expect to see regulations from them on trusted exchange. And we know that there's a lot of work that we still need to do. We need to address the issue of patient identification, the issue of standards. And while there's been a lot of great work done by FHIR and others, that's something that we're going to need to continue to work on. We are very excited that all of you are here today. Since we launched Blue Button, I think our number is around 600 developers that are starting to look at our data. I think that when we think about the data that's available, we're already thinking about it in terms of, well, patients are going to want this data so that they can understand their health. And we know that providers are going to want this data so that they can be able to understand their patient profile. And we're excited about the advances in artificial intelligence that's going to be able to take all of this data and make it meaningful. But I think today's conversation is also about where do we go from here? We know the basics, but I think that the potential of what this data could mean for our country, for healthcare, is really unimaginable.
Also in the nation's capital today, Colorado Governor John Hickenlooper was at that CPA conference we played a moment ago. Governor Hickenlooper was mentioned as a possible 2020 Democratic presidential candidate. Was also asked about the impact of marijuana legalization in the Rocky Mountain State.
I have a question. I'm going to preface my question by saying I grew up in Alberta, and I have 5 siblings with kids and grandkids in Denver. How has the legalization of recreational weed affected the business environment and the quality of the workforce in the Denver metro area?
You know, usually it's the first question.
That's why I started.
You know, you do one of these jobs and you, no matter what you think you're going to run on, the world, fate, delivers other choices for you. And I appreciate that question because it is what I get asked so frequently. I opposed the legalization of recreational marijuana But our state passed it 55-45. And I took an oath, and when we passed it, we put it in the Constitution. I took an oath to uphold that Constitution. So I view it as perhaps one of the great social experiments of this century. And we were going after it as aggressively as we can to see if we can make it work. And I will tell you, we have seen no problem with the business climate. In the same way that most people don't ever have to worry about people coming into work drunk, people haven't come into work high. And our Supreme Court has reaffirmed the right of any company to do, through urinalysis or any test, if someone's got THC in their system at any level, they can be fired. And that is every business's right. It's rarely happened. The big things we were worried about, a spike in consumption, didn't happen. A spike in teenage consumption, we were worried that the kids would think since we legalized it.
First suggestion, okay, because you'd walk around slingshot. Somebody's liable to shoot you. Like I said, I didn't know. You come here with a machine gun.
There are still